My name is Carenza Rowena, and I was 30 the night my mother stopped me in front of 50 Las Vegas socialites to announce I was too broke to eat with my own family. We were standing in the gilded foyer of Aurelia, the most exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant on the Strip. The crystal chandeliers cast sharp light over the waiting crowd when Sylvia pointed a manicured finger at my plain charcoal suit. She raised her voice, calibrating the volume so the wealthy investors standing nearby could hear every single word. She smiled a tight, venomous smile and told me the tasting menu was $800 a plate, and she would not have me begging for handouts at her table. She pointed toward the overflow lounge and told me to go drink tap water until they could bring me a to-go box. My sister snickered. Her fiancé smirked. What none of them knew was that my phone had just vibrated in my pocket with a banking alert. I do not work in a back-office cubicle like my mother told her friends. I am a hospitality venture capitalist, and 6 days prior, my firm had quietly purchased the entire restaurant chain. Welcome back to Morning Revenge, where toxic vanity meets quiet consequence. If you have ever been looked down on by the people who were supposed to protect you, tell me your age in the comments and hit subscribe. I stood in the foyer and let the silence hang. People who know me in the boardroom will tell you I never raise my voice during a hostile takeover. You learn a very specific type of stillness when you manage 9-figure portfolios. You learn that shouting is what people do when they have no leverage. So I did not shout. I just watched her. The air inside Aurelia smelled of imported white truffles and expensive desperation. In the high society enclaves of Summerlin and the Las Vegas Strip, securing a table at this restaurant was not about the food. It was a weapon. It was a way to measure your proximity to power. The velvet-roped waiting area buzzed with casino executives and real estate heirs draped in heavy designer logos, meant to broadcast their credit limits. The temperature was set to a crisp 68 degrees to combat the desert heat outside, but I could see beads of sweat forming on the foreheads of men, hoping their cards would not decline. In the middle of all that noise stood my mother. Sylvia was treating the reception desk like her own personal soundstage. She was busy adjusting the neckline of a sequined cocktail dress worn by my younger sister Bianca. Beside them stood Preston, the fiancé. He checked his reflection in the mirrored wall while holding a craft cocktail he had not paid for. He smelled of cheap cedar cologne, masking an expensive ego. "Turn slightly to the left, darling," Sylvia instructed, holding up her phone. "The lighting catches the diamond better from that angle. We need everyone to see the clarity." Bianca tilted her hand obediently, catching the ambient light. She looked picture perfect. She looked exactly like the daughter Sylvia wanted. A highly marketable asset ready to be traded for social elevation. Then Sylvia lowered the camera, and her practiced smile collapsed the second her eyes found me. I was standing near the coat check, wearing a tailored, unbranded wool suit. In a culture that weighs human worth by visible excess, my quiet simplicity made her physically uncomfortable. Or worse, it made her embarrassed. She crossed the marble floor, and I heard the sharp click of her heels cutting through the low jazz music playing from the ceiling speakers. "You wore that?" she asked. Her voice hovered at that specific pitch, meant to sound like maternal concern, but engineered to draw blood. "This is an engagement dinner, Carenza, not a quarterly review at whatever back office you sit in all day. Did you even try to find something suitable?" I felt the rough wool of my suit jacket against my wrist. I kept my breathing slow and even. "It felt appropriate for the occasion, Sylvia." "Appropriate," she repeated. She tasted the word like it was spoiled milk. "We are entertaining the Thorntons tonight. Preston's family owns half the commercial zoning in Henderson. I spent 3 weeks pulling favors for this reservation, and you arrive looking like a junior bank teller." I did not flinch. This casual cruelty was not a new development. 5 years ago, I refused to marry a local gaming magnate. I wanted to build my own equity firm from the ground up. Because I refused to play the role of a decorative wife, Sylvia cut me out of the family trust. She told everyone I was a stubborn failure, scraping by on a middle management salary. She needed me to be poor so her narrative made sense. I let her tell her stories while I built my capital the slow, quiet way, one acquisition at a time. Before she could dissect my appearance any further, the heavy glass doors at the front of the restaurant swung open. Richard and Patricia Thornton walked into the cool air. Patricia wore a heavy fur stole despite the 90-degree heat radiating off the pavement outside. Richard wore a custom suit that fit him poorly at the shoulders. Sylvia changed in a fraction of a second. The maternal disgust vanished. It was replaced by a gleaming, obsequious charm that made my stomach turn. She rushed forward with her arms extended wide. "Patricia, Richard, welcome. We are so thrilled you could join us." She physically positioned her body between me and the wealthy arrivals dragging the Thorntons over to the photo op with Bianca and Preston. I was left standing by the coat check, cast out of the frame. I watched Patricia Thornton accept a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. I noticed the way Patricia looked at Sylvia. It was a tight, patronizing smile, the kind of smile old money gives to new money when they are asking for too much attention. Sylvia was blind to the subtext. She was too desperate to secure the alliance. I stepped back against the wall. The heavy velvet curtains brushed my shoulder. My phone vibrated a second time against my ribs. I reached into my pocket and pulled it out, keeping the screen angled away from the crowded room. The bright light of a secure banking notification filled the display. I read the text twice. Rowena Capital LLC. Wire transfer cleared. Amount $120 million. Asset acquisition. Aurelia Hospitality Group finalized. I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The heat from the battery felt warm against my side. I looked across the foyer at my mother, who was currently laughing too loud at a joke Richard Thornton had just made. She was performing wealth so hard because she was terrified of losing it. I acquire distressed assets for a living. I know what a crumbling balance sheet looks like, even when it is dressed in sequins. The leased cars, the mortgaged house in Summerlin, the maxed-out credit lines used to buy designer dresses. Every dollar she spent was a lie, borrowed against a future she could not afford. I spent my 20s analyzing profit margins and operational debt. When you strip away the velvet ropes and the Michelin stars, a restaurant is just a machine that converts raw ingredients into social currency. Aurelia was the best machine in Nevada, and sitting in the center of it, watching my family pretend they were untouchable, felt like reading a ledger where the numbers do not add up. They were operating at a deficit of character and capital. I walked slowly behind the group as they moved toward the host stand. My heels made no sound on the imported rugs. I was the ghost in their machine, the forgotten daughter they invited only to use as a prop to make their own success look brighter. The maitre d' approached the group holding a leather-bound reservation book. He smiled a polite, practiced smile and asked Sylvia to follow him to the main dining room. The trap was set, and I was going to let her dig her own grave right here in my dining room. The maitre d' led our party away from the reception desk and into the cavernous expanse of the main dining room. Aurelia was designed to make its patrons feel small, while simultaneously inflating their egos. The vaulted ceilings stretched 3 stories overhead, covered in intricate, hand-painted gold leaf that caught the amber glow of the custom chandeliers. The tables were spaced far apart, ensuring a premium layer of privacy, while still allowing every guest to see exactly who occupied the best seats in the house. The air was filled with the low hum of hushed conversations, the soft clinking of heavy silver on fine porcelain, and the sharp scent of seared Wagyu beef. I walked at the very back of the group, keeping my pace slow and measured. Ahead of me, Sylvia maneuvered through the room, like a general inspecting troops. She kept Richard and Patricia Thornton close to her side, pointing out the imported blown glass fixtures and dropping the names of local politicians who frequented the establishment. She was working relentlessly to establish her territory before we even sat down. In the exact center of the room sat the focal point of the restaurant. The VIP Rotunda was a circular raised platform enclosed by thick, curved glass. It was the only architectural feature of its kind on the Strip. You did not just book the rotunda, you had to be vetted and invited to occupy it. Sylvia had burned through 6 months of hoarded social capital to secure the enclosure for a party of 12. The sound-dampening walls allowed the diners inside to remain in a private acoustic bubble while putting them on display for the rest of the restaurant. It was a literal fishbowl built for the Nevada elite. The maitre d' glided up the short carpeted ramp and pulled out the head chair for Patricia Thornton. As the rest of the party began filtering through the glass doors, I stepped onto the incline. Before my shoe could hit the top step, Sylvia materialized in the doorway. She moved with surprising speed, placing a flat palm against the brass doorframe to physically block my path. The ambient chatter of the surrounding tables seemed to dip. Sylvia did not lower her voice to keep the matter private. Instead, she projected. She calibrated her pitch so the wealthy patrons seated at the adjacent tables could hear every syllable of the exchange. "Carenza, sweetheart, wait." She looked me up and down. The faux sympathy pooling in her eyes was sharp enough to cut a diamond. She sighed the way a parent sighs at a reckless child. "There seems to have been a miscalculation with the reservation numbers," she announced. Her voice carried over the jazz music drifting from the ceiling. "This is a fixed-price tasting menu. It is $800 a plate." She let the number hang in the air, a heavy numerical weight designed to crush my dignity. "You simply cannot afford to sit with us, Carenza, and I will not have you asking for a handout in front of Preston's family. It would be incredibly uncomfortable for everyone to watch you struggle with the bill." The public execution was swift and precise. Behind my mother's shoulder, Bianca covered her mouth with a manicured hand, but a distinct nasal snicker leaked through her fingers anyway. Preston leaned against the back of his chair, adjusting his expensive cufflinks, with a self-satisfied smirk creeping across his face. Patricia Thornton looked away, pretending to inspect the exotic floral centerpiece, but I noticed the tight, judgmental line of her jaw. Richard Thornton checked his watch, feigning ignorance. They were all complicit in the theater. I did not break eye contact with Sylvia. I understood exactly what she was doing. This was not just an act of cruelty, it was a strategic financial distancing. In her mind, poverty was a contagious stain. By exiling me, she was proving to the Thorntons that she possessed the ruthless immune system required to cut out dead weight. 5 years ago, when I refused to sign a prenuptial agreement with a casino heir, she threatened to ruin my reputation in this exact city. I walked away then, and she operated under the assumption that I was still running. She wanted a scene today. She needed me to cry or raise my voice or beg for a seat at the table so she could play the exhausted victim of an unhinged failure. In my line of work, you encounter hostile negotiators who use public humiliation to force quick concessions. You learn very quickly that the only countermeasure to manufactured panic is absolute stillness. I did not shift my weight. I did not flush with embarrassment. I kept my face a mask of serene, untroubled calm. The surrounding diners were now openly staring, waiting for the explosion. "I will not give you one. I see," I said. My voice was quiet, steady, and drained of all defensive emotion. Sylvia blinked. The lack of resistance disrupted her script. She recovered quickly, waving a dismissive hand toward the back of the building. "Go wait in the lounge," she instructed, her tone hardening. "Have some tap water. We will have the kitchen pack you a to-go box when we finish here." I gave her a single, slow nod. I turned my back on the glass rotunda and walked down the ramp. I felt the gaze of 3 dozen diners tracking my movement across the floor. To them, I was the spectacle of the evening. The impoverished relative sent to the shadows so the real players could dine in the light. The overflow lounge sat in the rear corner of Aurelia, separated from the main dining floor by thick velvet drapes and dimly lit brass sconces. It was typically utilized by patrons waiting for their tables to be cleared, or by individuals who preferred to drink in anonymity. The air here smelled of old leather and citrus peel. I bypassed the bar stools and chose a high-backed booth in the far corner. The seat offered a direct, unobstructed view of the glass rotunda through the parted curtains. Back in the center of the room, Sylvia was already repairing the mood. I watched through the glass walls as she placed a gentle hand on Patricia Thornton's arm, laughing at a joke I could not hear. The tension in their group dissolved into the false warmth of shared superiority. Sylvia had asserted her dominance and purged the perceived liability from her guest list. Yet my compliance confused her. Even from 50 feet away, I could tell by the way her eyes kept darting toward the lounge every few minutes. She expected resistance or a tearful exit. My stoic retreat rattled her fragile sense of control. She did not realize that I was not retreating at all. I was simply securing a better vantage point for the collapse. A server wearing a crisp black uniform approached my booth holding a silver tray. He placed a single crystal glass of iced tap water on the polished wood in front of me, just as my mother had ordered. I did not touch it. Instead, I reached into my jacket and retrieved my phone. I bypassed the standard applications and opened the internal operations dashboard for the restaurant group. A secure network connection linked my device directly to the point-of-sale servers in the kitchen. I watched the screen as the engagement dinner was officially rung into the system under Sylvia's name. The initial authorization hold for a party of 11 flashed across the ledger. A moment later, the transaction row glowed a bright, urgent red. Her primary credit card had been declined by the merchant processor. Sylvia was currently sitting inside a transparent glass box, ordering thousands of dollars worth of courses on a line of credit that no longer existed. She was financially naked, and she did not even know it yet. I looked up from the screen. Walking across the main dining room floor, moving with the precise, unhurried pace of an executioner, was Vincent, the general manager of Aurelia. He was not carrying a wine list. He was carrying a leather-bound portfolio, holding the finalized acquisition paperwork meant only for the new ownership. And he was heading straight for the velvet drapes of my lounge. The heavy velvet drapes isolating the overflow lounge absorbed the ambient noise of the main dining floor, creating a quiet, isolated vacuum. I sat in a high-backed leather booth nestled in the far back corner. The dark upholstery smelled faintly of polished cedar and aged bourbon. Through a narrow vertical gap in the thick curtains, I maintained a clear, unobstructed line of sight directly to the VIP rotunda. Inside that illuminated glass cylinder, my mother was actively holding court. Sylvia gestured constantly with her hands, performing a theater of grandiosity designed to captivate Richard and Patricia Thornton. Even without the accompanying audio, her body language translated perfectly across the room. She was pantomiming the role of an untouchable matriarch, secure in her dynasty. A server wearing a spotless charcoal uniform approached my private table. He removed the glass of iced tap water Sylvia had originally demanded and replaced it with a chilled bottle of imported sparkling water. He poured the carbonated liquid into a fresh crystal flute, nodded respectfully, and retreated into the shadows without speaking a single word. I took a slow, calculated sip. The cold effervescence grounded my focus. Watching my mother perform reminded me of the underlying mechanics governing our relationship. Her affection was always conditional, tied directly to strict obedience and public optics. Half a decade prior, she summoned me to a similar elite dinner to issue a firm ultimatum. She had arranged a marriage for me with the heir to a local gaming syndicate. The union would have merged two distinct pools of Nevada influence, solving several of her hidden liquidity problems behind closed doors. When I declined the proposal, citing a desire to build my own independent equity firm, she retaliated with severe financial exile. She severed my access to the modest family trust and mandated a strict social quarantine. To justify her cruelty to her wealthy peers, she circulated a calculated fiction. She told the country club circuit I was a stubborn underachiever, languishing in a low-tier administrative job. She needed me impoverished to validate her decision to cast me out. I never bothered to correct her fabricated narrative. While she spent the next 5 years maintaining a facade of wealth through high-interest leverage, I built tangible capital. I analyzed distressed hospitality assets, acquired undervalued properties, restructured their debt, and sold them for substantial profit. Rowena Capital grew in the quiet spaces, away from the blinding neon flash of the Las Vegas Strip. Sylvia remained entirely oblivious, assuming my silence was definitive proof of my failure. The heavy drapes parted near the lounge entrance, allowing a slice of bright light to pierce the gloom. Vincent, the general manager of Aurelia, stepped into the dim room. In a city built on transient hospitality, Vincent was a rare, enduring institution. He possessed the refined posture of a career diplomat and the sharp, calculating eyes of a forensic auditor. He wore a bespoke navy suit that indicated his supreme authority over the vast dining room. He navigated the narrow pathway between the empty booths and stopped directly beside my table. He did not ask me to leave. He did not inquire about the tense scene near the rotunda. Instead, he offered a measured, respectful bow and placed a thick, leather-bound portfolio onto the polished mahogany surface in front of me. The heavy cover bore the gilded insignia of the restaurant group. "Good evening," managing partner Vincent said. His voice was a calm, resonant baritone. The final transition documents arrived from the legal department an hour ago. All transition contingencies are officially cleared and recorded. The property operations and inventory are fully under your firm. I opened the heavy leather cover to inspect the contents. Inside sat a stack of pristine legal instruments, the recorded deed of sale, the transfer of lucrative liquor licenses, the exclusive vendor contracts, and the proprietary asset lists. My signature crossed the bottom of the master agreement dated 6 days ago. Rowena Capital did not just own this specific location. We had acquired the entire Aurelia portfolio, spanning 3 states. "Thank you, Vincent," I replied, keeping my tone professional and even. "The transition appears seamless. I appreciate your discretion during the handover phase." He folded his hands behind his back, standing at attention. "Discretion is the cornerstone of our service, Ms. Rowena. However, we have a developing situation in the center rotunda." I traced the edge of the paper contract with my index finger, recalling the digital alert, the declined authorization. "Yes," Vincent confirmed. "The primary card on file for your mother's party flagged as insufficient funds. Standard operating procedure dictates we run a secondary card before the second course is served. Furthermore, the hostess informed me that the party is requesting off-menu allocations, specifically vintage reserve champagne. I wanted to verify your directives regarding their table. Given the public display earlier, I require your guidance on how to manage their service." Vincent was offering me a profound choice. I could authorize a complimentary meal, shielding my family from the humiliation of their insolvency. I could quietly pay the bill from my own operational accounts and let them finish their celebration ignorant of the rescue. Or I could enforce the strict rules of the establishment. I looked through the gap in the curtains. Inside the glass box, Sylvia was raising an empty wine glass, snapping her fingers to command a passing sommelier. The sheer entitlement radiated from her posture. She believed she owned the building simply because she occupied its most expensive seat. She was dining on a mirage, assuming the architecture of the restaurant would bend to her demands, regardless of her actual net worth. I turned my attention back to the general manager. "Vincent, what is the strict protocol for a table that demands premium service while failing initial credit authorization?" Vincent did not hesitate to answer. "We inform the host of the declined payment method away from their guests. We request an alternate form of payment. If they cannot provide one, we halt the food service immediately and present the bill for items already consumed. If they cannot settle that balance, we escalate to local authorities for theft of services." "And the off-menu requests?" I asked. "Denied," he stated flatly. "Premium seller allocations are reserved strictly for ownership and vetted high net worth accounts in good standing." I closed the leather portfolio and rested my hands flat on top of it. Treat them exactly according to standard protocol, Vincent. Do not expedite the confrontation, but do not afford them any special grace. When they order something they cannot afford, you will politely decline. When the bill comes, you will expect full payment. Let their own entitlement be the rope they hang themselves with. They are guests in my dining room, and they will abide by the mathematics of their own ledger. Vincent offered a slight nod, a gesture conveying deep professional respect. Understood, managing partner. We will process their table by the letter of the manual. I will notify the floor staff to proceed without deviation. He turned and exited the lounge, blending seamlessly back into the orchestrated chaos of the main floor. The trap was no longer just a theoretical concept. It was a structural reality embedded into the operational software of the restaurant. My mother had engineered this dinner to secure a financial lifeline from the Thornton family. She intended to use my sister as collateral, locking down a wealthy marriage to bail out her sinking ship. But she had chosen my venue to stage her fraud. I leaned back against the tufted leather of the booth. The sparkling water felt cold against my throat. The quiet anticipation settled over me like a heavy blanket. The mathematics of debt never lie. You can wear expensive sequins, and you can lease European luxury cars, but eventually, a merchant terminal processes a transaction, and the truth renders an impartial verdict. Sylvia was about to face a mathematical reckoning she could not charm her way out of. Through the glass walls of the rotunda, I noticed a sudden shift in the choreography of the dinner party. The first round of intricate appetizers had arrived. Delicate plates of imported caviar and seared scallops were distributed by the waitstaff. But Preston was not eating. The fiancé pushed his heavy chair back from the table and stood up. He smoothed the lapels of his custom-tailored jacket, checking his reflection in the curved glass of the enclosure. He leaned down, whispered something into Bianca's ear, making her giggle, and then patted his future father-in-law on the shoulder with practiced familiarity. Preston exited the rotunda. He did not head toward the restrooms located near the front reception desk. Instead, he turned his body, pointing his expensive leather shoes directly toward the back of the building, toward the velvet drapes hiding my booth. He was coming to the lounge. He was coming to gloat, to twist the knife my mother had inserted to establish his own dominance over the impoverished relative. I watched his approach, measuring the cadence of his steps. He walked with the unearned confidence of a man who believed he held all the leverage in the world. I adjusted the leather portfolio on the table, making sure the gilded insignia faced upward, waiting for him to pull back the curtain. The thick velvet fabric separating a lounge from the main dining floor shifted. A sliver of bright chandelier light sliced through the dim room, followed immediately by Preston. He stepped into the quiet space and let the heavy curtain fall shut behind him. The sudden isolation did not seem to bother him. He paused near the entrance, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit jacket with a practiced flick of his wrists. He scanned the empty leather booths until his eyes locked onto my corner table. He walked toward me with a slow, rolling gait. It was the specific posture of a man who spent his entire life inheriting credit rather than building it. As he drew closer, the scent of synthetic cedar and overpowering musk arrived before he did. It was an expensive cologne, applied far too generously, masking an underlying nervous sweat. Men who are secure in their fortunes do not bathe in fragrance before a simple family dinner. They do not need to announce their presence so loudly. Preston did not ask for permission to join me. He did not slide into the empty seat across the table either. Instead, he stood beside the booth, placing both of his manicured hands flat on the polished mahogany surface, and leaned his upper body into my personal space. It was a textbook physical intimidation tactic designed to force the seated person to look up and acknowledge his superiority. I did not lean back. I kept my posture straight and maintained my gaze on the crystal water glass resting near my fingertips. "It is pretty dark back here, Carenza," he noted. His voice carried a mocking, artificial sympathy. "It is a shame Sylvia had to move you, but you understand how these things work, right? This is a high-stakes evening for everyone." I remained silent, allowing his words to echo in the quiet room. Silence often forces insecure negotiators to keep talking to fill the void. Preston took the bait instantly. "Bianca has been incredibly stressed about you lately," he continued, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "She wants her sister at the wedding, obviously. But my parents are inviting the governor and several zoning commissioners. We are talking about a top-tier society event. We really cannot have you showing up looking like you just finished a local diner." He offered a short, patronizing chuckle. He was waiting for a reaction. He wanted to see anger or shame fracture my composure. He wanted the impoverished sister to shrink under the weight of his societal influence. When I offered him nothing but a cold, steady stare, he cleared his throat and pivoted to his main objective. "Look, I am a generous guy, Carenza. Bianca asked me to help you out, and I think I found a solution. My family owns Thornton Commercial Properties. You know this. We are expanding our front office staff next week. I can bypass the standard interview process and guarantee you a receptionist position." He tapped his index finger against the mahogany table to emphasize his benevolence. "You would be answering phones, greeting actual high-net-worth clients, and managing the executive calendar. It pays $18 an hour to start. Plus, you get health benefits after 90 days. It is a solid stepping stone for someone in your position. You could save up, buy a decent dress for the ceremony, and stop embarrassing your mother in public." I looked at his hands resting on my table. His fingernails were perfectly buffed, but the skin around his cuticles was chewed raw. A physical manifestation of severe anxiety hiding beneath a polished exterior. I shifted my gaze up his arms, noting the fabric of his suit. It was a custom cut, but the material was a mid-grade wool blend, not the pure worsted cashmere a true commercial real estate magnate would commission. He was cutting corners on his wardrobe to maintain the illusion of liquid wealth. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, swallowing the cold liquid before I finally spoke. "I appreciate the consideration, Preston," I said, my voice flat and devoid of gratitude. "But I prefer to keep my distance from volatile assets." His self-satisfied smirk faltered. He blinked, pulling his chin back a fraction of an inch. "Excuse me, Thornton Commercial Properties," I clarified, setting my glass down on the coaster. "I am curious how your Human Resources Department plans to fund new payroll expansions, especially considering the current liquidity crisis your firm is facing with the South Valley Logistics Center." The blood drained from his face with terrifying speed. His skin took on the pale, waxy hue of a mannequin. The arrogant posture evaporated instantly, replaced by a rigid, defensive stillness. "I do not know what you are talking about," he stammered. His voice was suddenly an octave higher. I folded my hands together, resting them near the leather portfolio Vincent had delivered earlier. I kept my tone conversational, delivering financial facts with the lethal precision of a surgeon. "South Valley Logistics Center?" I repeated. "A 300,000-square-foot commercial warehouse in Henderson. Your father purchased the asset 3 years ago using a highly leveraged capital stack. You have a 60% senior loan with a regional bank and a 20% mezzanine loan carrying a predatory 12% interest rate." Preston's hands slowly slid off the mahogany table. He took a half step backward, putting physical distance between himself and the data I was reciting. "Your anchor tenant, a national shipping provider, broke their lease last month." I continued, never breaking eye contact. "They filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, leaving your property 60% vacant. The current rental income does not cover the monthly interest obligations on the mezzanine debt. You have a massive balloon payment due in 45 days. If you do not secure a capital injection by the end of next month, the mezzanine lender will execute a uniform commercial code foreclosure and seize the equity." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. The cheap cologne could no longer mask the sharp, acrid scent of genuine panic radiating from his skin. The secret he and his father had buried deep inside restricted corporate filings was suddenly being spoken aloud in a dim restaurant lounge by a woman he assumed was destitute. "How do you know that?" he whispered. The condescension was entirely gone, replaced by raw, unfiltered fear. I did not answer the question. I did not tell him that Rowena Capital held the rights to the exact mezzanine debt paper currently suffocating his family. I did not explain that my analysts had reviewed his balance sheets last Tuesday and flagged his entire holding company as a high-risk default probability. Instead, I tilted my head, studying him like a specimen under glass. $18 an hour is a generous offer, Preston, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. But I suspect you will need that capital to pay your bankruptcy attorneys before the snow melts. His jaw tightened. A dark flush of humiliated rage crept up his neck, turning his collar bright red. He wanted to shout. He wanted to call me a liar. But he could not dispute the mathematics. He knew every single metric I cited was flawlessly accurate. You read some speculative blog post and think you understand commercial real estate? He hissed, pointing a shaking finger at my face. You are nothing, Carenza, just a jealous failure sitting in the dark because your own mother cannot stand the sight of you. He did not wait for a response. He spun around on his heel and practically fled toward the lounge exit. He pushed through the heavy velvet drapes with far too much force, disappearing back into the bright lights of the main dining room. I turned my head and looked through the narrow gap in the curtains. I watched him march back toward the glass rotunda. His stride was stiff and erratic. He pulled out his chair and sat down next to Bianca, reaching immediately for his water glass and drinking it dry in 3 rapid swallows. Richard Thornton noticed his son's pale complexion and leaned over to ask a question. Preston shook his head aggressively, pasting a fake plastic smile onto his face and pointing vaguely toward the restrooms. The pebble of conflict had dropped, revealing the hollow foundation of the entire dinner party. Preston and his father were not the wealthy saviors my mother believed them to be. They were drowning men searching for a lifeboat. Sylvia was looking to the Thorntons for a financial rescue, while the Thorntons were almost certainly looking to Sylvia's perceived wealth to bail out their collapsing real estate portfolio. It was a brilliant, tragic symmetry. 2 empty vaults attempting to merge, hoping the combined illusion of wealth would somehow generate actual currency. They were building a house of cards inside a glass box. I picked up my sparkling water and took another deliberate sip. The restaurant hummed with the sound of clinking silverware and expensive jazz. I did not feel anger toward my sister or her fraudulent fiancé. I felt the predatory patience of an auditor who had just located the missing funds. I sat in the velvet shadows guarding the heavy leather portfolio and waited for the first card to fall. Through the thick acoustic glass of the VIP enclosure, the dinner appeared like a silent film dedicated to extreme luxury. But inside the rotunda, the air was thick with unstated desperation. Waiters in pristine uniforms delivered plates of poached lobster and shaved truffles, moving with choreographed grace. Sylvia smiled, radiating a warmth that never reached her eyes. She picked up a heavy silver fork, pressing her thumb against the ornate handle until the knuckle turned bone white. She was playing the role of the generous matriarch, but every passing minute cost her money she did not possess. Bianca sat next to Preston, staring blankly at the exotic rare orchids woven into the centerpiece. She leaned closer to her mother, keeping her voice low enough to escape the Thorntons' ears. "The florist needs the final deposit by Tuesday," Bianca whispered, her smile fixed perfectly in place. "They will not release the ceremony arch without $50,000 cleared, and the string quartet is demanding payment up front." Sylvia did not look at her daughter. She took a tiny mechanical bite of her lobster. "It is handled, darling," she replied smoothly. "Do not clutter your mind with logistics." But it was not handled. Sylvia's entire existence in the affluent neighborhoods of Summerlin was an elaborate shell game masking a deep financial void. The sprawling mansion backing up to the private golf course carried 3 separate mortgages. The European sports cars parked in her circular driveway were leased under a corporate entity that was currently 60 days past due. Her designer wardrobe, the very clothes she used to mock my simple suit, was funded by rotating balances on a dozen high-yield credit cards. This dinner was never about celebrating a marriage. It was a calculated corporate merger. Sylvia needed a cash injection to prevent immediate ruin, and she was using Bianca's youth and perceived pedigree as the collateral to secure it. Sylvia dabbed her lips with a linen napkin and turned her attention to Richard Thornton. "Richard," she began, her tone dripping with manufactured intimacy. "I was reviewing the preliminary guest list for the country club reception. It is going to be quite the summit. The mayor confirmed his attendance this morning. I know you and Patricia are handling the rehearsal dinner, but I wanted to discuss the primary wedding gift." Richard stopped chewing. He placed his fork down and wiped his mouth. Patricia stiffened beside him, clutching her evening bag. Traditionally, Sylvia continued pressing her advantage before they could deflect the bride's family handles the ceremony costs. But considering the scale of this union, I thought it would be prudent for our families to establish a joint equity fund for the couple, a foundational nest egg to secure their commercial real estate portfolio. I am prepared to match a 6-figure contribution tonight if you are willing to commit. It was a bluff, a desperate, high-stakes gamble. Sylvia did not have a 6-figure contribution to give. She was banking on Richard writing a substantial check to the couple, which she would then quietly intercept and siphon to pay off her most urgent creditors. Richard shifted in his chair. He was a man who survived 3 decades in Nevada commercial zoning by recognizing a bad deal. He looked at Sylvia, noting the slight tremor in her hands and the rigid posture of her neck. He glanced at his son Preston, who was staring fixedly at his water glass, sweating profusely through his expensive cologne. "A joint equity fund," Richard repeated. His voice lacked the enthusiastic warmth Sylvia required. "That is an interesting proposition, Sylvia, but Preston's trust does not vest until he turns 35. Our capital is currently tied up in several major logistical developments. Perhaps we should table the financial discussions until after the lawyers finalize the prenuptial agreements." The word prenuptial landed on the table like a lead weight. Sylvia felt her stomach plummet. If the Thorntons unleashed their forensic attorneys to draft a binding marital contract, they would demand full financial disclosures. They would see the empty bank accounts. They would see the staggering debt-to-income ratio. The illusion would shatter before the invitations were even printed. Sylvia forced a light musical laugh. "Oh, Richard, let us not ruin a beautiful evening with talk of lawyers. We are family now. We operate on blind trust." 50 feet away, in the shadows of the velvet lounge, I watched the entire exchange unfold. I could not hear their words, but I did not need to. I could read the sharp angle of Richard's shoulders and the sudden panicked stiffness in my mother's spine. The negotiation was failing. The Thorntons were evasive and skeptical, sensing the rot beneath the floorboards. I reached into my bag and pulled out a slim digital tablet. The restaurant ambiance glowed softly against the dark screen as I woke the device. I bypassed my venture capital portfolios and opened a secure encrypted folder my private investigators had compiled earlier that week. I needed to understand the exact dimensions of the battlefield before I engaged the enemy. The file contained the public financial records of a holding company named Summerlin Vanguard LLC. It was the primary corporate shield my mother used to mask her personal spending. I scrolled through the itemized ledgers. The data was a devastating map of her vanity. She had taken out a predatory title loan on her vehicle to afford the down payment on Bianca's engagement ring. The diamond Preston paraded around as a family heirloom was actually financed by my mother at 22% interest. She was defaulting on her country club dues. 2 separate boutique fashion houses in Beverly Hills had filed civil claims against her for unpaid merchandise. 5 years ago, she told the world I was a failure because I refused to marry a man I did not love. She banished me to the fringes of society to protect her pristine image. Looking at the cascading red numbers on my screen, the emotional betrayal of my past translated into cold, quantifiable data. She did not cast me out because she was ashamed of me. She cast me out because my independence threatened her fragile ecosystem of dependency. She needed a daughter she could sell, and I refused to be priced. I tapped the screen, bringing up the most recent judicial filing. Summerlin Vanguard LLC had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection 12 days ago. The documentation was sealed pending judicial review, but the court docket was public, if you knew exactly where to look. My mother was sitting in the most expensive dining room in the state, ordering delicacies she could not afford, while actively navigating federal bankruptcy proceedings. The audacity of her performance was almost impressive, but a performance cannot pay a vendor. A performance cannot satisfy a lien. I set the tablet down next to my sparkling water. I felt no urge to march over to the glass rotunda and shout my discoveries. Screaming is a release of tension, and I wanted the tension to build until it crushed the glass box they were sitting in. I prepared to dismantle her illusion, utilizing the cold, immovable reality of financial sovereignty. Inside the rotunda, Sylvia realized she was losing control of the narrative. Richard Thornton's evasive response regarding the wedding gift had introduced a dangerous seed of doubt. Patricia Thornton was now looking around the restaurant, inspecting the other patrons, instead of paying attention to her host. The balance of power was slipping away from the bride's family. Sylvia needed a grand gesture. She needed to reassert her dominance and prove her elite status beyond any reasonable doubt. She needed an undeniable symbol of wealth to force the Thorntons back into submission and erase the mention of a prenuptial agreement. I watched her turn her head and snap her fingers toward the floor. It was a sharp sound that cut through the polite murmur of the dining room. A senior sommelier, dressed in a pristine black vest, hurried toward the glass enclosure, carrying a leather-bound wine list. Sylvia did not take the menu. She waved it away with a flick of her wrist. She sat up perfectly straight, projecting her voice so the neighboring tables could witness her authority. She was about to make a demand that would trigger the trap I had laid with the general manager. The house of cards was trembling, and she was about to pull the final foundational pillar out with her own hands. Inside the transparent cylinder serving as her temporary kingdom, my mother decided to deploy her ultimate defensive maneuver. I watched her raise her right hand into the conditioned air. She pinched her thumb and middle finger together, executing a sharp, distinct snap. In polite society, signaling service staff like stray dogs is considered exceptionally gauche. In the hyper-competitive ecosystem of Las Vegas elite dining, it functions as a deliberate display of dominance. It tells everyone within earshot that you believe your wealth eclipses basic human decency. The sound cracked across the quiet hum of the surrounding tables. A senior wine steward standing near the main corridor turned his head immediately. He was a seasoned professional, wearing the silver Taste of Inn emblem around his neck, indicating advanced sommelier status. He moved swiftly toward the elevated platform, navigating the narrow pathways between diners with fluid grace. Sylvia did not bother looking at him when he arrived at her elbow. She kept her gaze fixed on Richard Thornton, projecting an aura of boundless generosity. The Thorntons were still radiating skepticism from the failed prenuptial deflection. She needed to blind them with an expenditure so magnificent they would forget their doubts. "We are celebrating a momentous union tonight, Richard," she announced, her voice echoing slightly against the curved acoustic glass. "Standard vintage simply will not suffice for this caliber of merger." She finally turned her face toward the waiting steward. Her smile was tight, revealing too many teeth. "Bring us a bottle of the 1996 Aurelia Estate Reserve," she commanded. The name of that specific vintage hung in the atmosphere like a physical object. The 1996 Reserve was not printed on any menu circulating through the dining room. It was a legendary artifact, hidden deep within the subterranean climate-controlled cellars of the property. Cultivated from a highly restricted vineyard harvest 3 decades prior, the yield produced fewer than 200 bottles globally. Within the Nevada Social Registry, ordering it was the ultimate flex. At $15,000 per unit, it separated mere millionaires from actual billionaires. My mother had never tasted it, but she knew its reputation. She assumed her credit limit, or at least the illusion of it, could unlock any door. I evaluate rare commodities differently than the average consumer. To Sylvia, a $15,000 bottle was a magical elixir that could cure her poverty by blinding her peers. To my firm, it was a highly illiquid asset requiring specialized storage insurance premiums and depreciation metrics. When Rowena Capital executed the buyout, I immediately flagged the 96 reserve. I removed it from the menu, not to hoard it, but to restructure our luxury offerings. It was a calculated operational adjustment. My mother interpreted a corporate spreadsheet modification as a personal vendetta against her soul. The steward maintained a perfectly neutral expression. He clasped his hands behind his lower back. "I apologize, madam," he replied, his tone respectful but entirely unyielding. "That particular selection is no longer available for public purchase." The manufactured warmth vanished from Sylvia's face. The muscles along her jawline pulled taut. She blinked rapidly, processing the rejection. In her curated reality, service workers did not issue denials. They bent reality to accommodate her whims. "Perhaps I misspoke," she countered, lowering her voice into a dangerous register. "I am not asking for a recommendation. I am instructing you to retrieve the 96 reserve. I know you hold at least 4 bottles in the private vault." "We do indeed possess the inventory, madam," the steward acknowledged, offering a slight placating bow. However, the new ownership group implemented a strict allocation directive just yesterday. The remaining vintage is exclusively designated for private internal utilization. It cannot be sold at any price. Patricia Thornton shifted uncomfortably in her chair, observing the friction. Richard crossed his arms, leaning back away from the table. The grand gesture was collapsing, transforming into a public embarrassment. Sylvia perceived the steward's refusal not as a corporate policy, but as a direct, lethal assault on her societal ranking. If she accepted the denial, she would look weak in front of the exact people she desperately needed to intimidate. A mottled crimson flush crept up the base of her neck, spreading across her collarbone. "I do not care about some arbitrary administrative update," she hissed, dropping the facade of polite society. "I am a Tier 1 patron. I spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in this city every single year. You will go downstairs, unlock the cellar, and pour that beverage right now, or I will ensure you never work in hospitality again." The steward did not flinch. He absorbed the toxic threat with the armor of a man who knew his employer possessed infinitely more capital than the angry guest screaming at him. "I will fetch the general manager to further assist you," he said, turning sharply and exiting the enclosure. From my secluded booth in the velvet shadows, I watched the entire sequence unfold. The initial credit card failure had armed the trap, but this specific arrogant demand was the trigger. I took a slow breath of the cedar-scented air. My mother was suffocating inside a vacuum of her own creation. Bianca was currently staring at her lap, pretending she was invisible. Preston rubbed his temples, actively avoiding eye contact with his father. Richard Thornton was a man who respected leverage. He watched Sylvia unravel, and I saw the exact moment he calculated the risk of associating his family brand with hers. The calculation yielded a massive deficit. Patricia leaned away from the table, physically distancing her expensive fur stole from Sylvia's flailing arms. The rotunda, which was designed to showcase elite status, had transformed into a transparent quarantine zone holding a very volatile infection. Vincent appeared on the floor, moving with authoritative calm. The general manager bypassed the serving stations and walked directly up the ramp into the VIP rotunda. He stood at the head of the table, radiating chilling professionalism. His navy suit offered a stark contrast to the glittering, chaotic energy radiating from Sylvia. "Good evening, Vincent," began his baritone voice, smooth and devoid of intimidation. My staff informed me there is a misunderstanding regarding our seller allocations. There is no misunderstanding, Sylvia snapped, pointing a manicured fingernail at his chest. Your employee is incompetent. I requested the estate reserve. I expect it decanted and served immediately. Vincent folded his hands in front of his waist. Madam, the steward communicated our protocol accurately. The asset you requested has been permanently withdrawn from commercial circulation. It is strictly reserved for the proprietor of this establishment. We cannot process a sale. The final boundary was drawn. A rational person would recognize the absolute finality in Vincent's posture. A rational person would pivot, order a different expensive item, and salvage the remaining dignity of the engagement celebration. But Sylvia was not operating under rational parameters. She was operating under the frantic adrenaline of imminent bankruptcy. She slammed her palm flat against the heavy linen tablecloth, making the silver cutlery rattle against the porcelain plates. The sharp noise caused several patrons at nearby tables to turn their heads, openly observing the spectacle. The protective glass cylinder could no longer contain her meltdown. Vincent did not summon security. He did not ask her to leave. He followed the exact parameters I outlined in the velvet room. He let her entitlement pull the rope tight. Every loud word she projected, every threat she levied against the establishment, dug the trench deeper. Reserved for the proprietor, she mocked, her voice climbing into a shrill, hysterical octave. Do you have any idea who I am? I bring immense value to this building. This is an insult. It is a targeted, malicious insult. Madam, please lower your voice, Vincent requested, holding his ground. You are disrupting the dining experience of our other guests. I will disrupt whatever I please, she shrieked, standing up from her chair. The Thorntons watched in horrified fascination as the elegant matriarch dissolved into a raving tyrant. You listen to me, Sylvia demanded, leaning across the table toward the general manager. You will fetch the owner of this restaurant right now. I demand to speak to the person in charge. Bring them to this table immediately, or I swear I will contact every local press outlet in Nevada. I will destroy your reputation in the morning papers. Bring me the owner. From the quiet darkness of the lounge, I slowly placed my crystal water glass down onto the mahogany table. The request had been made on the public record. My mother demanded the proprietor. It was time to answer the call. The atmosphere inside the glass enclosure reached a critical boiling point. Sylvia's shrill demand for the owner hung in the conditioned air, vibrating against the transparent walls. The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. It was the exact type of quiet that precedes a catastrophic structural failure. Bianca shattered that silence. She buried her face in her manicured hands and released a loud, theatrical sob. Her shoulders heaved under her sequin dress. She was not crying because she felt genuine sorrow. She was crying because the carefully curated narrative of her flawless high society engagement was disintegrating. The spotlight had shifted from her pristine diamond ring to her mother's unhinged behavior, and Bianca needed to reclaim the center of attention. You are ruining my special night, Bianca wailed, pointing an accusatory finger at Vincent. Her makeup remained miraculously intact despite the dramatic tears. We came here to celebrate my future, and you are treating us like common criminals. Preston recognized his cue to perform the role of the protective patriarch. He pushed his chair back, allowing the wooden legs to scrape harshly against the floorboards. He puffed out his chest, attempting to physically intimidate a man who spent his entire career managing volatile egos. Preston adjusted his tailored lapels and adopted a stance he likely practiced in a mirror. You have made a severe miscalculation, buddy, Preston threatened, jabbing a finger toward the general manager. My family retains the most ruthless litigation firm in the state. I will have my lawyers draft a tortious interference lawsuit before the sun comes up. You are looking at a multi-million-dollar defamation settlement for humiliating my fiancé. Vincent absorbed the barrage of legal threats and performative tears with the stoic grace of a marble statue. He did not blink. He did not offer a defensive rebuttal. He understood that engaging with their hysteria would only validate it. Across the circular table, Richard and Patricia Thornton were undergoing a profound, silent realization. Richard was a pragmatist who built a commercial zoning empire by accurately assessing risk. He watched Preston's puffery and Bianca's artificial weeping with clinical detachment. He looked at Sylvia, who was still standing with her chest heaving, trying to project an authority she did not possess. The Thorntons exchanged a single loaded glance. It was a silent conversation communicating volumes. They finally saw through the cheap veneer. Sylvia and her brood were not the refined, wealthy peers they had pretended to be. They were crass, entitled liabilities. They were the exact type of desperate, loud people that true generational wealth actively avoided. Richard recognized that tying his corporate legacy to this chaotic family would be a fatal public relations disaster. He slowly pulled his hands off the table, resting them in his lap, signaling a physical and emotional withdrawal from the entire engagement. Vincent offered a crisp, shallow bow. His posture communicated professional finality rather than subservience. "I understand your frustrations," Madam Vincent said, his baritone voice cutting cleanly through the noise. "As you have invoked a request for upper management, I will fetch the executive chef and former proprietor, Chef Laurent. He will address your table directly. Please remain seated." Vincent turned and walked down the ramp, leaving the VIP rotunda locked in a tense, vibrating stasis. The glass box, which was originally engineered to showcase their untouchable status, now functioned as a transparent quarantine zone. They were trapped on a literal pedestal while the rest of the dining room watched their collapse. Diners at the surrounding tables were no longer pretending to ignore the spectacle. Wealthy patrons lowered their silver forks and openly stared at the bride's family. A few guests whispered behind their linen napkins. The social currency Sylvia had spent months hoarding was evaporating into the ambient jazz music. She sat back down slowly, her chest tight, her eyes darting nervously around the room as the weight of public scrutiny settled onto her shoulders. Inside the dim sanctuary of the overflow lounge, I pressed the power button on my digital tablet. The screen went black, erasing the damning financial records of my mother's bankruptcy. I slipped the device into my leather briefcase and secured the brass clasp. The prelude was over. The administrative trap was fully armed, and the primary targets were locked inside the perimeter. I stood up from the tufted booth. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal suit. I did not feel the erratic pulse of adrenaline that typically accompanies a family confrontation. I felt the slow, steady rhythm of an underwriter closing a complex acquisition. 5 years of silent exile. 5 years of being the discarded daughter used as a cautionary tale were culminating in this precise mathematical alignment. I stepped out from behind the mahogany table and moved closer to the velvet drapes. I parted the heavy fabric just enough to observe the shifting mechanics of the main floor. The pacing of the room quickened. I watched the orchestrated, seamless movement of the personnel as they prepared for the shift in power. It was a balletic maneuver. The floor managers subtly redirected the flow of foot traffic. The hostess stationed at the front desk halted all new seating assignments holding incoming reservations in the foyer to clear the center aisles. It was a tactical clearing of the battlefield. The employees did not know the personal history between the woman in the charcoal suit and the woman in the sequin dress. They only knew that the operational hierarchy had shifted, and they were executing the transition flawlessly. Aurelia was a complex ecosystem operating on precise, invisible currents. Waiters carrying trays of cleared plates bypassed the rotunda entirely. Busboys diverted their routes. The service perimeter around my mother's table was systematically abandoned, isolating them in a physical vacuum. Then I saw the senior wine steward emerge from the subterranean stairwell. He was the same man Sylvia had threatened to destroy mere minutes earlier. His posture was impeccable. He walked onto the dining room floor, carrying a polished silver tray. Resting in the center of the reflective metal was a dark green bottle, lightly dusted with cellar frost. The label bore the unmistakable crest of the 1996 Estate Reserve. The foil wrapping around the cork was pristine, a testament to 3 decades of undisturbed preservation. Flanking the priceless vintage were 2 flawless crystal flutes, catching the ambient light and throwing tiny prisms across the pristine tablecloths. Sylvia noticed his approach from inside her glass enclosure. A triumphant sneer began to form on her lips. She assumed her threats had successfully broken the administrative blockade. She believed the restaurant was finally capitulating to her demands, bringing her the ultimate prize to appease her wrath. She sat up straighter, preparing to accept the surrender. But the steward did not turn toward the elevated ramp. He did not adjust his trajectory toward the VIP rotunda. He maintained a straight line, walking parallel to the glass walls. The silver tray caught the light of the overhead chandeliers, flashing a brilliant reflection directly into Sylvia's eyes. She watched in stunned incomprehension as the $15,000 bottle bypassed her table completely. The steward headed toward the back corner of the building. He was walking directly toward the dimly lit, velvet-draped overflow lounge. He was bringing the forbidden vintage to the discarded daughter. The physical elements of the establishment were actively turning against the matriarch. The architecture, the inventory, and the staff were operating under a new sovereign command. Sylvia pressed her hands against the acoustic glass, staring at the retreating back of the wine steward. Her triumphant smile melted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. She finally realized the building was not bending to her will. It was preparing to crush her. The heavy brushed steel double doors leading into the main culinary staging area swung outward with a muted, pneumatic hiss. The sudden movement disrupted the carefully curated visual harmony of the dining room, drawing the collective gaze of every patron. Stepping through the threshold was Chef Laurent. He was a towering architectural figure in the gastronomy community. He did not wear the tailored suits favored by the investors who dined in his establishment. He wore a pristine, traditional white chef coat, buttoned to the collar unblemished by a single stain. Laurent built Aurelia from a forgotten desert outpost into a Michelin-recognized fortress. I respected his legacy. When my firm initiated the acquisition, we did not negotiate in a high-rise boardroom. Laurent and I finalized the terms over black coffee, sitting in a stainless steel prep kitchen, long after the staff had gone home. He cared about the integrity of his menu, not the vanity of the clientele. He agreed to sell the property to Rowena Capital because I promised to maintain his exacting standards while shielding him from the bureaucratic overhead. We shared an unspoken alliance forged in operational mathematics. As his imposing frame moved onto the carpeted floor, Sylvia immediately registered his presence from inside the VIP enclosure. Her eyes widened, recognizing the legendary culinary maestro. The panic that had briefly hijacked her nervous system vanished, replaced instantly by a surge of unearned triumph. She smoothed the front of her sequin dress and stood up from her leather dining chair. Sylvia was preparing to accept a surrender. She assumed her hysterical threats to contact the local press had successfully intimidated the management. In her distorted reality, the chef was marching out to personally apologize for the wine steward's insubordination. She pasted a tight, condescending smile onto her face, adjusting her posture to project the image of a merciful queen preparing to pardon a peasant. Laurent walked purposefully, navigating the main aisle with long, deliberate strides. The ambient chatter of the restaurant died away, leaving only the soft, rhythmic jazz notes filtering down from the ceiling. Diners suspended their forks mid-air, watching the titan of the industry cross the floor. Sylvia took a half step forward inside her transparent box. She raised her chin, resting her fingertips delicately on the edge of the linen tablecloth. She opened her mouth, her lips parting to deliver a rehearsed monologue of faux forgiveness. She was ready to tell him that she accepted his apology and that she expected the $15,000 bottle decanted immediately. Laurent reached the base of the carpeted ramp leading up to the rotunda. He did not slow down. He did not break his stride. He did not even turn his head to acknowledge the woman standing inside the glass cylinder. He walked straight past the VIP enclosure. The air rushed out of Sylvia's lungs. Her mouth remained open, forming a silent, vacant circle. She turned her head, tracking his movement as he bypassed her designated sanctuary. Preston sat frozen in his chair, his arrogant smirk erased. His father, Richard Thornton, watched the chef pass with a deep, furrowed brow, his calculating mind struggling to process the navigational anomaly. Patricia Thornton lowered her crystal water glass, her eyes darting between the empty ramp and the approaching chef. Laurent continued his march, heading directly toward the dim recesses of the back corner. He walked past the luxury booths, past the imported floral arrangements, and stopped squarely in front of the heavy velvet drapes guarding the overflow lounge. I stood waiting in the shadows. The senior wine steward had already arrived, placing the silver tray onto my mahogany table. The chilled bottle of 1996 Estate Reserve rested beside the two empty crystal flutes. Laurent parted the fabric and stepped into my secluded space. He stopped short of the table and offered a deep, respectful bow. It was not the shallow, placating gesture given to demanding patrons. It was a gesture of profound professional submission, acknowledging a transfer of sovereignty. "Good evening, Ms. Rowena," Laurent said. He did not whisper. He projected his deep, resonant voice, allowing the acoustics of the building to carry his words outward into the silent dining room. The sound waves penetrated the acoustic glass of the rotunda 50 feet away. "The transition paperwork is fully executed," Laurent continued, standing upright and offering a warm, genuine smile. "The kitchen is yours." The sommelier stepped forward, moving with practiced theatrical grace. He wrapped a white linen cloth around the neck of the legendary vintage. With a swift, precise motion, he extracted the cork. The soft pneumatic pop echoed through the quiet lounge, signaling the release of an asset no amount of credit could purchase. The steward poured the pale golden liquid into the first crystal flute. The carbonation hissed a delicate, luxurious sound that carried profound legal implications. He placed the filled glass directly in front of me. I looked through the gap in the velvet curtains, maintaining a direct line of sight to the center of the restaurant. Sylvia was still standing. Her condescending smile had frozen into a rigid, grotesque grimace. The physical foundation of her curated universe was fracturing in real time. For 5 years, she had controlled the narrative, convincing the Nevada elite that I was a destitute failure. She had banished me to the shadows to prove her own superiority. Now, the most respected figure in Las Vegas hospitality had just walked past her table to bow at my feet and declare me the proprietor of the very institution she used to measure her worth. Her eyes darted frantically, searching the faces of her guests for an explanation. She looked at Bianca, who was staring at the lounge with her mouth agape, her theatrical tears instantly forgotten. She looked at Preston, who was gripping the arms of his chair, his knuckles stark white, recognizing that he had just mocked the owner of the building. The ultimate devastation arrived when Sylvia looked at the Thorntons. Richard Thornton was not confused. His gaze shifted from the velvet lounge back to the woman standing at the head of his table. The calculating patriarch connected the dots with ruthless efficiency. He realized that the woman who had just ordered a $15,000 bottle of champagne could not even afford the appetizers sitting in front of him. He realized that Sylvia had humiliated a venture capitalist titan because she was fundamentally blind to genuine wealth. The mask of pure, uncomprehending horror finally settled over my mother's features. Her knees buckled slightly, forcing her to grip the edge of the table to remain upright. The illusion was dead. She was standing inside a transparent cage, exposed to the exact society she worshipped, stripped of her leverage and her dignity. I picked up the crystal flute, wrapping my fingers around the delicate stem. I did not raise the glass in a mocking toast. I did not smile. I simply maintained eye contact with the woman who had traded my future for a favorable loan application. The engagement dinner was officially bankrupt. But the reckoning was far from over. Richard Thornton pushed his heavy wooden chair backward, breaking the hypnotic silence of the rotunda. He stood up, brushing a stray crumb from his tailored trousers, his face set in a hard, unforgiving line. The patriarch of the commercial zoning empire was preparing to interrogate the ruins of my mother's deception, and the structural integrity of his son's upcoming marriage was about to be subjected to a fatal stress test. Laurent turned his broad shoulders away from the velvet lounge. He raised a single hand. The gesture was subtle. A deliberate flick of the wrist directed toward the elevated sound booth nestled above the climate-controlled wine racks. The audio technician stationed in the shadows caught the signal instantly. The ambient jazz music cascading from the ceiling speakers faded into nothing. The sudden absence of rhythm acted like a vacuum. It sucked the remaining chatter out of the dining room. Diners stopped chewing their food. Waiters halted their strides, balancing heavy silver trays with practiced grace. The only sound left in the cavernous space was the low electrical hum of the public address system waking up. A floor manager stepped forward, handing Laurent a sleek wireless microphone. The legendary chef gripped the device. He tested the audio feed with a brief exhale. The sound carried crisp and clear, echoing off the gold leaf vaulted ceiling. Laurent surveyed the room. His gaze swept over the wealthy patrons, the local politicians, and the casino executives. He did not look at the VIP rotunda. He treated the glass enclosure like an empty space. "Ladies and gentlemen," Laurent began. His rich baritone voice commanded profound respect. "Thank you for joining us at Aurelia. This establishment has always strived to be a pinnacle of culinary art. We have spent years cultivating an environment where quality speaks louder than volume. Tonight is a historic evening for all of us. We are officially turning a page in our legacy." The diners sat enraptured. Nobody reached for their wine glasses. "It is my distinct privilege to welcome our new proprietor," Laurent continued. "We are moving forward under the guidance of a visionary leader. Please join me in officially welcoming the managing partner of Rowena Capital." Laurent pivoted back toward the velvet drapes. He extended the microphone, offering it like a baton. I stepped out of the shadows. The harsh glow of the crystal chandeliers washed over my tailored charcoal suit. I did not hurry. I did not project a boastful swagger. I moved with the terrifying quiet gravity of someone who possessed the deed to the building. The fabric of my jacket moved seamlessly with my stride. I bypassed the silver tray holding the rare vintage champagne. I reached out and took the microphone from Laurent. I nodded to him. It was a silent transaction of mutual respect. I turned to face the dining room. Hundreds of eyes tracked my every movement. I felt the weight of their scrutiny, but it did not register as pressure. It felt like leverage. 5 years ago, my mother tried to convince this exact demographic that I was an incompetent failure. She fed them a narrative of my supposed poverty to elevate her own status. I did not need to shout to correct the record. The architecture of the moment did the work for me. My gaze drifted across the polished floor and locked onto the center of the room. I stared directly into the glass rotunda. Sylvia was standing frozen by her dining chair. Her face was a canvas of raw disbelief. The sequined fabric of her dress caught the light, but the woman wearing it looked hollowed out. Bianca sat beside her, gripping the edge of the linen tablecloth. Her knuckles were stark white against the pristine fabric. Preston had stopped pretending to be confident. His posture mirrored a cornered animal. "Thank you, Laurent," I said into the microphone. My voice resonated evenly across the vast room. I did not allow a single tremor of emotion to slip into the audio feed. It is an honor to curate the standard of excellence here. I took a slow, measured breath. I kept my eyes anchored to my mother. the woman who banished me to the overflow lounge to hide my perceived inadequacy. At Rowena Capital, we believe that true hospitality is about authenticity, I continued, the syllables clipped with precision. We believe it is about genuine substance, not performance. The word performance struck the acoustic glass. Sylvia flinched. She recognized the subtext. Her entire existence was a theatrical display, built on a foundation of unserviceable debt. She leased her cars. She financed her jewelry. She staged this engagement dinner to extract a bailout from the Thorntons. Everything she presented to the world was a high-interest facade. I lowered the microphone slightly, letting the final sentence form in my mind. I recalled the exact phrasing she used in the foyer. She told me she would not have me asking for a handout. She told me I could not afford to sit with her. I raised the microphone back to my lips. I hope everyone at the rotunda table enjoys their evening, I said. My tone remained impeccably polite, a masterclass in corporate hospitality. Your meal is, of course, fully comped. I handed the microphone back to Laurent. The silence in the rotunda was absolute. The trap was sprung. In the hyper-materialistic culture of the Nevada elite, paying the bill is a sacred ritual. Throwing down a platinum card is how you establish dominance. It is how you prove you belong at the table. Receiving a complimentary meal from the chef is an honor. But receiving a fully comped meal from an estranged relative you just publicly humiliated is the ultimate lethal insult. It classified Sylvia not as a Tier 1 patron, but as a charity case. It declared to the entire room that she was incapable of settling her own ledger. I watched the color drain entirely from my mother's face. Her mouth opened, but her vocal cords failed to produce a sound. The realization crushed her. She could not throw a tantrum. She could not demand to speak to the manager. She could not threaten to call the press. I was the manager. I was the press. I owned the ground she was standing on. Patricia Thornton reacted first. She reached for her fur stole, pulling the heavy fabric tightly around her shoulders. She physically turned her body away from Sylvia, establishing a visible barrier. The gesture communicated an immediate severing of social ties. Patricia recognized the stench of financial ruin, and she was quarantining herself from the fallout. Richard Thornton understood the mechanics of power. He was a veteran of brutal commercial zoning wars. He recognized a flawless execution when he saw one. He did not look at me. He looked at Sylvia. He processed the word comped. He analyzed the desperation in Sylvia's posture during the earlier prenuptial discussion. He evaluated her frantic demands for off-menu champagne. The puzzle pieces locked together with devastating clarity. Richard Thornton realized the woman hosting this lavish dinner was broke. The entire engagement was a smokescreen, engineered to access his capital. The patriarch of the Thornton family slowly turned his head. His interrogating gaze shifted away from the ruined matriarch and settled directly onto his son. Preston swallowed hard, his throat constricting visibly against his tight collar. The sweat on his forehead caught the chandelier light. He had spent the entire evening playing the role of the wealthy benefactor. He had walked into my lounge and offered me a pity job answering phones for $18 an hour to mask his own impending commercial default. Now his father was looking at him with cold, calculating suspicion. Richard was evaluating the structural integrity of this entire engagement. If the bride's family was insolvent, what other fictions were hiding beneath the surface? Richard knew his own firm was carrying toxic debt, but he assumed this marriage would provide a safety net. Realizing there was no safety net forced a rapid recalibration of loyalty. The public humiliation portion of the evening was complete. The financial reckoning was just beginning. Richard Thornton placed both of his hands flat on the mahogany table, bracing himself to ask a question that would tear the remaining facade to shreds. The public address system clicked off. The soft electrical hum vanished, leaving a void that felt heavier than concrete. Sylvia lost her structural integrity. She descended into her heavy leather dining chair, not with the practiced grace of a high society matriarch, but with the dead weight of a bankrupt debtor. Her skin, previously flushed with manufactured indignation, turned a dull, sickly gray. The expensive sequin dress she wore suddenly looked like a cheap, discarded costume. She stared blankly at the pristine linen tablecloth. The realization crashed over her nervous system. The woman she had exiled to the shadows now possessed the deed to the sun. Sylvia held zero leverage. No amount of charming banter could overwrite a broadcasted declaration of charity. She was effectively zeroed out. Beside her, Bianca began to hyperventilate. The rhythmic, shallow gasps sounded like tearing silk in the quiet enclosure. For her entire adult life, my younger sister had curated a flawless digital existence. Every vacation, every meal, every relationship was a heavily filtered asset deployed to attract high-net-worth suitors. The engagement to Preston represented the crown jewel of her social feed. She had planned to monetize the wedding, leveraging the Thornton name for lucrative brand sponsorships. Now that carefully constructed illusion was disintegrating in real time. She gripped her smartphone, her knuckles stark white, paralyzed by the knowledge that 50 patrons in the dining room had likely recorded her mother's meltdown and the subsequent humiliation. The social capital she depended on to survive had evaporated into the conditioned air. Preston shifted his weight, his custom leather shoes scraping harshly against the floorboards. He attempted to maintain his trademark arrogant facade, puffing his chest slightly, but the mechanics were entirely wrong. His eyes darted nervously between his silent father and the velvet lounge. He was trapped in a specialized hell of his own making. Less than an hour ago, he had leaned over my table and offered me a receptionist position, attempting to assert dominance over a woman he assumed was destitute. Now the horrific mathematics locked into his brain. He grasped that he had just insulted a venture capitalist titan who held the exact mezzanine debt currently suffocating his family's commercial real estate portfolio. He realized I possessed enough liquid capital to purchase his entire lineage and liquidate them for spare parts. His throat worked as he swallowed a visible gulp of pure terror. The most devastating reaction materialized across the circular surface. Richard Thornton was a ruthless pragmatist. He built his Henderson zoning empire by identifying fatal flaws in complex contracts. He looked at Sylvia, observing her hollowed-out posture. Then he looked at the velvet lounge where I had been banished. The calculation processed behind his cold eyes with lethal efficiency. He understood that true generational wealth does not announce itself. It does not demand off-menu champagne or scream at general managers. True wealth sits quietly in the corner observing the board. Richard connected the dots. Sylvia Rowena banished a major hospitality tycoon to an overflow lounge because she was fundamentally blind to actual capital. She could only recognize wealth if it wore a designer logo. Therefore, Sylvia herself was a financial imposter. She was a liability. The proposed joint equity fund for the newlyweds was a scam. The bride's family was insolvent. Patricia Thornton reached the same conclusion through a different, more visceral metric. The matriarch of the zoning dynasty pulled her fur stole tighter around her neck. She shifted her chair backward, putting physical distance between herself and my mother. Patricia leaned away as if Sylvia carried a highly contagious airborne pathogen. In their elite ecosystem, poverty was a disease, and my mother was patient zero. I stepped away from the velvet drapes. I did not hurry. I walked across the main dining room floor with the measured, unhurried cadence of an underwriter surveying an acquired asset. The surrounding patrons watched my approach in total silence. I was no longer the discarded daughter walking the perimeter. I was the landlord inspecting the premises. My charcoal suit, previously mocked as drab and inappropriate, now registered as the armor of apex authority. The fabric moved seamlessly with my stride, a silent testament to tailored precision. As I navigated the wide aisles, I thought about the decade I spent building Rowena Capital. I started with nothing, meticulously analyzing distressed properties, pulling 16-hour shifts, poring over balance sheets, while my family attended galas. I was explicitly forbidden to enter. They worshipped the aesthetic of success. I worshipped the architecture of ownership. They spent money to look rich. I deployed capital to buy the ground they stood on. The divergence in our philosophies had led us to this exact coordinate. The glass doors of the VIP rotunda remained open, a breached fortress. I walked up the short carpeted incline and stepped inside the enclosure. The air felt different in here. It tasted metallic, laced with cortisol and ruined ambitions. I walked slowly around the perimeter of the table, my footsteps silent on the thick carpet. I stopped at the head of the table, claiming the exact spot where Vincent had stood mere moments before. I looked down at the imported porcelain plates. The poached lobster sat untouched, growing cold in pools of congealed butter. The crystal water glasses were sweating onto the linen. The overlapping conflicts of my life converged in this single, inescapable moment of public exposure. The emotional betrayal enacted by my mother, the financial fraud orchestrated by her vanity, and the corporate acquisition I executed in the shadows all collided at this specific table. Sylvia could not lift her head. The woman who had spent the entire evening projecting her voice to ensure the room heard her superiority was now mute. Her silence was the ultimate concession. She had traded her daughter for a seat at the table, only to discover I owned the table, the chairs, and the building surrounding them. She was a tenant facing an eviction she could not afford to fight. The vacuum of power demanded a response. Richard Thornton remained an immovable stone, watching the dynamic play out. Bianca was lost in a spiral of hyperventilation, the quiet stretched tight and suffocating. Preston, driven by the frantic adrenaline of a man watching his commercial empire slide toward foreclosure, decided he had to act. He could not accept the silence. He needed to reframe the disaster. He needed to prove to his father that he could negotiate his way out of the trap. Preston placed his hands on the table, forcing a shaky, desperate smile onto his face, and opened his mouth to pitch a lifeline that would only serve to hang him faster. The silence inside the glass rotunda stretched tight and suffocating. It was a physical weight pressing down on the imported linens and the untouched plates of cold lobster. Preston could not endure the quiet. Men who build their identities on borrowed credit are terrified of silence because it allows the people around them to actually think. He needed to control the narrative. He pushed his heavy wooden chair back, allowing the legs to scrape harshly against the polished floorboards. He stood up and forced a laugh. The sound was hollow and brittle, echoing off the curved acoustic glass like a dropping coin. He adjusted his tie, sliding his fingers down the silk fabric in a practiced gesture of false confidence. He plastered a wide, familiar smile onto his face, attempting to transform a catastrophic public exposure into a casual networking opportunity. Well, Carenza, he began projecting his voice to ensure his father could hear the pivot. If you have got this kind of liquid capital sitting around, maybe we should talk business. Thornton Commercial Properties is prepping a Series B funding round next month. Since we are going to be family, it makes sense to keep the equity in-house. We could bring Rowena Capital in on the ground floor. He finished the pitch with a slight nod, as if he had just offered me a profound honor. He was trying to rewrite the hierarchy. Minutes earlier, he offered me a minimum wage receptionist job to humiliate me. Now he was offering me a seat at his boardroom table, attempting to position us as corporate equals. It was a desperate, frantic maneuver to prove his worth to the patriarch sitting silently to his left. I did not laugh. I did not raise my voice to mock his audacity. I simply looked at him with the cold, clinical precision of a forensic underwriter evaluating a toxic asset. In the venture capital sector, you learn to identify the exact moment a founder realizes their prospectus is a fiction. You look for the micro expressions, the slight widening of the pupils, the shallow breathing, the rigid posture. Preston was exhibiting every single indicator of terminal financial distress. "I reviewed your firm prospectus last Tuesday, Preston," I said. My tone remained conversational, but the syllables carried the lethal weight of undeniable data. The fake smile fractured instantly. His jaw went slack. "Your debt-to-equity ratio is catastrophic." I continued, keeping my gaze locked directly onto his eyes. "You are carrying a severe imbalance of short-term liabilities against long-term illiquid assets. Specifically, your new commercial developments in the West Loop are over-leveraged by 40%. You secured high-interest mezzanine financing to cover the construction overruns, and the primary anchor tenants backed out of their lease agreements 3 weeks ago." Preston stopped breathing. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. He reached out and gripped the edge of the table to steady his trembling hands. The specific figures I was quoting were supposed to be buried under layers of corporate non-disclosure agreements. They were secrets he had kept hidden, even from his own family. Hearing them spoken aloud in the middle of a Michelin-starred restaurant stripped him of his remaining dignity. "According to my analysts, you are 3 weeks away from a terminal liquidity crisis," I stated. "When that balloon payment comes due, you will default on the primary loans. The bank will trigger the cross-collateralization clauses and seize your entire portfolio. You do not need Series B funding, Preston. You need a miracle." I shifted my focus away from the terrified fiancé and turned my attention toward Richard Thornton. The patriarch of the zoning empire sat remarkably still. His hands rested flat on his thighs. He was processing the numbers I had just delivered. Richard knew his son was managing the West Loop project, but he had clearly been fed fabricated progress reports. The realization that his designated heir was driving their family business into foreclosure washed over him in real time. "I assume this engagement was the bridge loan strategy?" I asked, tilting my head slightly toward Richard. The question landed like a physical strike. I outlined the exact architecture of the fraud. Preston knew the West Loop project was collapsing. He knew he needed a sudden influx of cash to satisfy the mezzanine lenders before his father discovered the deficit. Marrying into the Rowena family was supposed to be his salvation. He believed Sylvia possessed genuine generational wealth. He intended to use the lavish wedding gifts and the anticipated dowry to quietly bail out his underwater properties. Richard Thornton turned his head very slowly. He locked his eyes onto his son. The older man's face darkened, shifting into a deep, mottled shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched collar. He did not yell. He did not need to. The sheer, radiating fury pouring off the patriarch was terrifying to witness. He realized Preston was not just incompetent, but actively deceitful. His son was willing to risk the Thornton legacy to cover up a string of catastrophic real estate gambles. Preston withered under his father's glare. He shrank back into his tailored jacket, shaking his head in a pathetic, silent plea for mercy. There was no mercy available. The bridge loan strategy was exposed, and the collateral was worthless. Sylvia watched the Thorntons imploding and recognized that her last remaining lifeline was snapping. If Richard Thornton pulled his support, she would face her own bankruptcy proceedings without a safety net. The carefully choreographed illusion she spent years cultivating was burning to the ground, and she needed to extinguish the fire. She reverted to her oldest established tactic. She attempted to manipulate the narrative using maternal authority. She stood up from her chair, her sequined dress catching the light. She reached her hands out toward me, adopting a tone of wounded, frantic affection. "Carenza, darling," Sylvia stammered, her voice wavering. "Let us not do this here. People are staring. Let us go to the back office and talk as a family. We can sort this out privately. I am sure there is a misunderstanding." She emphasized the word family, hoping the concept would trigger some residual loyalty. She wanted me to step out of the public eye so she could negotiate in the shadows, where her tears and guilt trips held power. She wanted me to save her. I did not step backward. I raised a single hand holding my palm flat in the air between us. The gesture was simple, but it carried undeniable finality. It was the physical manifestation of a boundary that could not be crossed. Sylvia stopped moving. Her outstretched hands hovered in the conditioned air, rejected and useless. "We aren't a family, Sylvia," I said. My voice was quiet, but the acoustics of the rotunda amplified the cold, unyielding truth of the statement. I stripped away the biological title she used as a weapon. 5 years ago, she told her elite social circle I was a burden. She cut my funding. She erased my presence from her life because I refused to be a pawn in her financial schemes. She traded her maternal duties for a country club membership. She did not get to reclaim the title of mother simply because her accounts were overdrawn. "We are patrons and ownership," I clarified, delivering the final blow with surgical precision. "And right now, you are disrupting my dining room." The words hung in the air, severing the final thread of their illusion. I categorized her not as a relative in distress, but as an unruly customer creating a disturbance. It was the ultimate demographic downgrade. I watched the realization settle deep into her bones. She possessed no authority. She held no leverage. She was sitting in a glass box, surrounded by the wreckage of her own vanity, waiting for the final bill to arrive. The quiet following my declaration hung thick and heavy over the imported centerpiece. Sylvia lowered her suspended hand. Her fingers curled inward, trembling slightly as they dropped back to her side. The matriarch finally understood she possessed zero leverage. A predictable individual might have summoned security guards to forcefully escort the unwanted party out onto the scorching pavement of the Strip. Ejecting a disgraced socialite creates a spectacle. It generates gossip and transforms the exiled person into a tragic victim. In the hyper-competitive ecosystem of Nevada high society, a public expulsion provides ammunition for future sympathy campaigns. I operate on structure, not theatrical drama. I had no intention of gifting my mother a narrative where she could play the persecuted martyr. I intended to bestow a punishment far more devastating than physical removal. I planned to grant her total systemic irrelevance. I turned my head away from her defeated posture and looked toward the perimeter of the elevated platform. Vincent stood waiting in the shadows, with his hands clasped behind his back. He was the maestro of this orchestrated symphony, awaiting the final cue to lower the curtain on the grand illusion. "Vincent!" I called out. My tone remained conversational, maintaining the cadence of a routine administrative update. The general manager stepped forward immediately, stopping at the edge of the carpeted incline. He offered a crisp nod, awaiting his instructions. "My mother and her companions are no longer designated as elite guests," I instructed. "Their status is officially downgraded to standard walk-in patrons. Please remove the privacy screens entirely. Cancel the remainder of their tasting menu and halt all incoming courses." I paused, letting the administrative commands wash over the seated diners. "Bring them the standard itemized checks for everything they have already consumed," I concluded. "However, please deduct the cost of the complimentary tap water my mother so generously offered me earlier tonight. We must ensure our accounting remains impeccably accurate." Vincent did not smile. He did not betray a single ounce of smug satisfaction. "Understood, managing partner," he replied. "We will adjust their classification immediately." The general manager raised his right hand, executing a series of swift, tactical gestures toward the waiting service personnel. The response was a marvel of military precision. A half-dozen staff members converged on the circular enclosure simultaneously. They moved without speaking, guided by years of rigorous hospitality training. 2 technicians approached the brass control panels located at the base of the transparent structure. They engaged the retraction mechanism. The quiet mechanical hum of hidden motors vibrated through the floorboards. The thick acoustic panels isolating the table began to slide along their embedded tracks. The curved barriers parted, pulling away from the center and disappearing into the concealed architectural pockets built into the surrounding columns. The psychological impact of the retracting barriers was instantaneous and profound. For the past 2 hours, Sylvia and her selected cohort enjoyed the luxurious vacuum of an elite fishbowl. They were insulated from the common noise of the dining room, allowed to converse in secure superiority while remaining visually prominent. Now that protective shield evaporated. The ambient sounds of Aurelia crashed over the table like a sudden tidal wave. The clinking of silverware, the low hum of hundreds of conversations, and the bright notes of the jazz soundtrack flooded the space. The physical barrier separating them from the society they desperately wished to conquer vanished. They were no longer perched on a pedestal. They were simply sitting at an oversized table in the middle of a crowded room, exposed to the elements. The surrounding patrons noticed the structural shift immediately. Wealthy diners sitting at adjacent tables turned their heads. They recognized that the privacy screens were never retracted mid-meal unless a catastrophic breach of protocol occurred. Dozens of unblinking eyes locked onto the bride's family. The whispers began rippling outward through the room like a localized weather system. People pointed discreetly. They evaluated the pale faces and the rigid, terrified postures of the individuals sitting on the platform. My mother shrank into her leather chair. The woman who previously demanded the attention of every server in the building now wished to become utterly invisible. During my childhood, Sylvia frequently lectured Bianca and me about the vital importance of visibility. She preached that being unseen in upper-tier circles was equivalent to social death. She spent her entire adult life clawing her way into the spotlight, financing her wardrobe with predatory loans just to ensure people looked at her. Now everyone was looking. The collective gaze of the Las Vegas elite burned into her skin. They were not looking at her with envy or admiration. They were analyzing her with the cold, detached curiosity usually reserved for a multi-vehicle highway collision. She was stripped of her armor. The illusion of her wealth was ruthlessly torn away, leaving her financially naked in front of the exact demographic she worshipped. Bianca crossed her arms over her sequin dress, hugging her own torso as if trying to shield herself from the heavy scrutiny. Her carefully constructed digital reality was actively dissolving. She could not filter this moment. She could not crop out the surrounding diners staring at her ruined engagement party. The luxury lifestyle she planned to monetize was a hollow shell, and the entire city was currently observing the collapse. Preston kept his head bowed, staring at the white linen tablecloth. His expensive cologne could no longer mask the sharp scent of his own ruined ambition. He realized the social currency he hoped to extract from this union was entirely bankrupt. By associating himself with my mother's fraudulent display, he had permanently damaged his own fragile reputation. He sat frozen, terrified to make eye contact with anyone in the room, especially the older man sitting to his left. 2 servers arrived at the table carrying black leather presenters. They did not approach with the deferential grace reserved for high net worth clients. They moved with brisk, transactional efficiency. They placed the padded folders directly onto the table, one in front of Sylvia and the other in front of Richard Thornton. The final remnant of the tasting menu was officially terminated. There would be no imported dessert courses. There would be no rare vintage champagne. There was only the cold, hard mathematics of the items already ingested. Sylvia stared at the leather folder resting near her plate. She did not reach for it. She knew her credit accounts were frozen. She understood that opening that book would reveal a staggering numerical deficit she could not satisfy. The trap I constructed was flawless because it relied entirely on her own vanity. I did not force her to order poached lobster. I did not compel her to book the most expensive enclosure in the state. She authored her own destruction, and now she was forced to read the final chapter in front of a live audience. Richard Thornton picked up his designated folder. He opened the cover, inspecting the itemized receipt. He was a man accustomed to settling immense corporate ledgers, but the numbers printed on the small slip of paper represented a different kind of toll. It was the price of admission to a fraudulent theater production. He pulled a heavy metal credit card from his tailored jacket pocket, placing it onto the tray with a sharp, definitive click. He settled his portion of the debt without hesitation. Then, the patriarch turned his cold, evaluating stare back toward Sylvia. He watched the disgraced matriarch trembling in her chair, unable to even touch her own bill. The financial discrepancy was glaring. The bride's family could not cover their own consumption. The tension shifted rapidly, introducing a fresh layer of immediate conflict. The exposure was complete, but the resulting fallout was just beginning to fracture the alliances at the table. Richard Thornton possessed the definitive proof he needed to terminate the merger. He had witnessed the financial impotence of the Rowena family. Now he prepared to execute the final extraction, pulling his son out of the wreckage before the sinking ship dragged their own collapsing real estate portfolio into the abyss. I stood near the edge of the platform, watching the patriarch of the zoning dynasty prepare to speak the words that would officially dissolve the engagement. Richard Thornton sat in the exposed air of the dining room, studying the paralyzed woman sitting across the table. He did not possess a single ounce of pity for Sylvia. Men who built their empires ruthlessly navigating municipal zoning laws understood that weakness was a deliberate choice. He recognized that her entire persona was a highly leveraged fiction engineered to trap his family. He picked up his heavy linen napkin. He did not fold it with polite grace. He dropped it directly onto his porcelain plate, allowing the expensive fabric to soak up the congealed butter from the untouched lobster. The gesture was a definitive physical punctuation mark. He pushed his heavy wooden chair backward, standing up to his full, imposing height. The ambient noise of the restaurant continued to swirl around the elevated platform, but the immediate space near their table felt like a pressurized vacuum. Richard looked down at my mother. His expression held no anger. It held something far more devastating: utter, unadulterated contempt. "You are bankrupt," he stated. His voice was flat, carrying no interrogative inflection. It was a statement of absolute fact, confirming the financial data I presented moments earlier. "You staged this entire evening to secure a capital injection from my family," he continued, his tone clinical and cold. "You intended to use my son as a debt relief program to bail out your collapsing lifestyle." Sylvia did not attempt to deny the accusation. The sheer terror of being publicly exposed robbed her of her usual defensive venom. She remained seated, staring at the white tablecloth, as if praying the woven fabric would open up and swallow her whole. The truth was an immovable object, and she lacked the kinetic energy to fight it. Richard shifted his cold, calculating gaze away from the ruined matriarch and looked at the young man sitting to his left. Preston flinched under the crushing weight of his father's disappointment. "And you are an idiot," Richard said. The words struck the fiancé like physical blows. Preston shrank backward, his shoulders rolling inward. "You jeopardized the structural integrity of our corporate holdings because you lacked the basic competence to vet your own partners," Richard admonished, keeping his volume low but lethal. "You allowed this desperate, insolvent woman to humiliate our brand in the center of the city." Patricia Thornton did not require any further instructions. The matriarch of the real estate dynasty stood up, retrieving her expensive evening bag from the back of her chair. She did not look at Sylvia or Bianca. She simply turned her back on the wreckage and began walking down the carpeted incline. Richard followed her, his posture rigid and unforgiving. They moved through the crowded dining floor, slicing through the whispering patrons with the arrogant grace of people who knew their bank accounts could withstand any temporary social scandal. Preston scrambled to his feet, his chair tipping backward and hitting the floorboards with a loud wooden crack. He ignored the fallen furniture. "Wait," he pleaded, his voice cracking with pure, unfiltered panic. "Dad, please, wait. We can restructure the West Loop debt. We can fix this." He chased after his parents, abandoning the table and the terrified young woman he had promised to marry. He practically jogged toward the front reception desk, leaving a trail of cheap synthetic cologne in his wake. The engagement officially dissolved in less than 30 seconds. It did not end with a dramatic argument or a tearful cinematic goodbye. It ended the exact way toxic corporate mergers always end, with a brutal, rapid severing of liabilities. The Thorntons identified a bad investment and liquidated their involvement before the market closed. Bianca realized the implications immediately. The Thornton name, the vast commercial real estate portfolio, the lavish wedding she intended to monetize for lucrative brand sponsorships, everything evaporated into the conditioned air. She opened her mouth and released a sound that stripped away her carefully curated digital persona entirely. It was a loud, unfiltered, wailing sob. The noise was ugly and raw, tearing through the sophisticated acoustic atmosphere of the restaurant. She wept for the loss of her future social currency, mourning the sudden death of a luxury lifestyle she had never actually earned. Her tears ruined her pristine cosmetic application, leaving dark streaks across her cheeks. Beside the weeping bride, Sylvia remained entirely frozen. The physical mechanics of her body seemed to shut down. She stared at the black leather presenter resting quietly next to her crystal water glass. Inside that padded folder sat the itemized bill for a multi-course tasting menu engineered for 12 guests, $800 a head, plus the exorbitant state luxury taxes and mandatory service gratuities. The total sum represented a fraction of the overall debt she carried, but in this specific localized moment, it was the only number that mattered. She could not pay it. Her credit lines were dead. The wealthy investors she tried to trap had fled the building. She was stranded on an exposed platform, facing the mathematical reality of her own suffocating vanity. I watched the complete structural collapse of their operation with profound clinical detachment. I felt no urge to comfort my sobbing sister. I felt no sympathetic impulse to rescue my paralyzed mother. In the high-stakes sector of venture capital, you learn to separate human emotion from logical consequence. If an executive engineers a fraudulent ledger, they must bear the full crushing weight of the resulting audit. The overlapping conflicts of my life had reached a perfect simultaneous resolution. Bianca's artificial engagement was permanently severed, removing her primary avenue for unearned elevation. The arrogant fiancé was crushed under the weight of his own impending foreclosure, destined to lose his properties to the mezzanine lenders. And my mother's hidden insolvency was publicly verified in the center of the very society she worshipped. The patrons sitting at the adjacent tables slowly returned their attention to their own expensive meals. The spectacle had reached its apex, and the elite crowd inherently understood that staring too long at poverty was bad luck. They categorized my family as a localized cautionary tale and moved on. That is the true brutal nature of the Nevada high society ecosystem. You are only relevant as long as your merchant transaction clears the processing terminal. The exact moment your card declines, you become a ghost. Sylvia was now a ghost, haunting the very establishment she tried to conquer. The leather presenter containing the check seemed to emit a dark gravitational pull. Sylvia's eyes remained locked onto the embossed gilded logo. The waiter who delivered the folder had retreated, standing silently near a marble column, anticipating the inevitable failure of payment. I knew the exact strict protocol that would follow. If she did not produce a valid payment method within 15 minutes, the floor manager would approach the table. He would request alternative financing in a polite, hushed tone. If she failed a second time, the local municipal authorities would be dispatched to process a formal citation for theft of services. It was a sterile, bureaucratic procedure that would strip away the final shred of her dignity, forcing her into the back of a police cruiser. The total destruction of her master plan left Sylvia with a singular, desperate option. She could not fight the restaurant management because I was the management. She could not charm the Thorntons because they were already in their chauffeured vehicle heading back to Henderson. The only source of liquid capital remaining in the room was the daughter she had banished to the shadows an hour prior. I watched her physical posture shift. The rigid, catatonic paralysis slowly gave way to the frantic, calculating movements of a cornered predator. She lifted her head from the white tablecloth and turned her gaze toward the edge of the platform where I stood. The tears she summoned to her eyes were completely artificial, a final manipulative gambit designed to extract a financial bailout from the very person she spent 5 years trying to destroy. She was preparing to cross the absolute boundary I established, preparing to leverage the biological concept of family one last time. I retreated from the elevated platform, navigating the wide aisles toward the brushed steel swinging doors guarding the culinary staging area. The ambient jazz resumed its low, rhythmic pulse, washing over the crowded dining floor. Patrons returned their focus to their expensive meals, treating the shattered engagement party like a localized weather anomaly that had successfully passed. I stood near the polished metallic boundary separating the public venue from the private operational sector. From my vantage point, I monitored the transparent rotunda. Sylvia finally broke her catatonic paralysis. She pushed her heavy wooden chair backward, leaving the black leather presenter untouched on the pristine linen tablecloth. She reached down and grabbed Bianca's wrist, pulling the weeping bride upward. Bianca stumbled her sequined dress, catching the ambient light, her flawless cosmetic application ruined by genuine, unfiltered despair. The disgraced matriarch did not head toward the front reception desk. She abandoned her designated exit route. Instead, her frantic gaze scanned the perimeter until she located my charcoal suit standing near the kitchen entrance. Sylvia marched across the carpeted floor, dragging her sobbing daughter behind her. The physical transformation was grotesque. The arrogant high society queen who demanded rare vintage champagne a mere hour ago was entirely gone. In her place stood a desperate, cornered animal running out of oxygen. She approached my position, navigating the narrow spaces between the occupied booths with erratic, stumbling steps. When she reached the threshold of the operational sector, she deployed her final manipulative gambit. She engaged the biological weapon she utilized throughout my entire childhood. The tear ducts activated. Genuine moisture welled in her eyes, spilling over her lower lashes. Her lower lip began to tremble, executing a flawless performance of manufactured maternal vulnerability. "Carenza, my beautiful, brilliant girl," Sylvia murmured, her voice cracking with artificial emotion. She reached her hands outward, attempting to grasp my tailored sleeves. I took a single, measured step backward, maintaining a sterile physical distance. Her fingers grasped nothing but the conditioned air, dropping uselessly to her sides. "I always knew you possessed a unique fire," she continued. Refusing to acknowledge the physical rejection, I always recognized your immense potential. When I pushed you away 5 years ago, it broke my heart. But I knew you needed the harsh reality to motivate your ambition. The tough love worked perfectly. Look at the magnificent empire you built. I am so incredibly proud of the titan you have become. I stood perfectly still, observing the mechanics of her psychological pivot. It was the classic maneuver of a seasoned manipulator. She was attempting to rewrite history, aiming to claim a retroactive percentage of my success. She wanted to frame her brutal financial exile and relentless public humiliation as a calculated nurturing strategy. She needed to tether her sinking vessel to my ascending rocket. "Please, Carenza," she begged, lowering her volume to a conspiratorial whisper. "You must clear that invoice sitting on the table. Richard abandoned us without settling the remaining balance. I do not possess the necessary liquid capital tonight. We share the same blood. You cannot let your own flesh face a municipal criminal citation for theft of services. You must protect your family." She clasped her hands together, resting them against her chest, a theatrical posture of absolute submission. Bianca stood behind her shoulder, hiccuping softly, her eyes glued to the polished hardwood floor, unable to witness the total degradation of their social standing. I did not flinch. I did not offer a sympathetic nod. I looked at the tears streaming down her pale cheeks and felt zero corresponding empathy. In the venture capital sector, an auditor does not negotiate with a fraudulent ledger. The auditor simply delivers the final binding verdict. I opened my mouth and returned the exact ammunition she fired at me inside the gilded foyer earlier that evening. "You cannot afford to sit with us, Sylvia," I stated. The syllables struck her like physical projectiles. The manufactured tears stopped flowing instantly. The manipulative warmth evaporated from her features, replaced by a stark, terrified comprehension. I drew an absolute, uncrossable boundary. I deployed her own arrogant terminology to seal her fate. "I am not clearing your invoice," I explained, my tone remaining clinical and devoid of mercy. "Furthermore, you are severely underestimating the scope of your current liability. My firm does not merely acquire distressed hospitality properties. Rowena Capital operates a highly sophisticated proprietary data analytics subsidiary. We utilize automated algorithms to scrub civil court dockets, municipal tax registries, and active bankruptcy filings to assess potential market risks." Sylvia's jaw went slack. The blood drained entirely from her face, leaving her skin a translucent, sickly hue. "When the maitre d' entered your reservation into our proprietary software last week, the system automatically cross-referenced your primary holding entity." I continued delivering the forensic reality with surgical precision. "The algorithm identified the active Chapter 11 bankruptcy petition filed under Summerlin Vanguard LLC." She swallowed hard, her throat constricting against a sudden wave of nausea. "However, the software does not simply passively monitor the data I elaborated. I programmed a specific contingency protocol. The moment your initial credit authorization declined tonight, our automated systems dispatched a secure encrypted alert directly to the municipal creditors listed on your bankruptcy docket." The matriarch stumbled backward, her expensive designer heels wobbling on the smooth floorboards. "Your creditors are currently receiving a time-stamped, itemized ledger of your consumption at this premium venue," I informed her. "They possess verified documentation proving you are purchasing poached lobster and attempting to order $15,000 vintage champagne while concurrently claiming total insolvency. The bankruptcy trustee will review this expenditure tomorrow morning. They will immediately pierce your corporate veil, citing blatant fraudulent conveyance. Your remaining assets will be seized and liquidated before the weekend concludes." Bianca released a sharp, terrified gasp, finally comprehending the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe. She realized her specialized ecosystem was dead. She possessed no marketable skills, no viable education, and zero independent capital. She had relied entirely on her mother's ability to secure a wealthy suitor. Now, the primary architect of her future was facing federal asset liquidation. The weeping bride sagged against a marble column, her sequined dress scraping against the cold stone, a discarded prop from a canceled theatrical production. Sylvia opened her mouth, her vocal cords struggling to formulate a coherent defense. "You engineered my total ruin," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ambient jazz music. "You destroyed your own mother." "I did not destroy anything, Sylvia," I countered, my posture remaining flawlessly rigid. "I merely accelerated the mathematical consequences of your own vanity. You built a structural illusion, and I provided the gravity required to bring it down." I took a half step forward, closing the physical distance, forcing her to tilt her head backward to maintain eye contact. I prepared to deliver the final airtight ultimatum, leaving zero room for future emotional manipulation. "Listen to me very carefully," I commanded, lowering my vocal register to a lethal whisper. "If you ever attempt to contact me again, this conversation will seem pleasant by comparison. If you ever invoke my name, if you ever attempt to leverage a biological connection to Rowena Capital to secure a loan, a country club membership, or a dinner reservation, I will initiate a total scorched earth protocol." I maintained unblinking eye contact, watching the sheer terror lock into her pupils. I will release the complete forensic audit of your shell companies directly to the local Las Vegas business journals I promised. I will distribute the itemized data to every zoning commissioner, every casino executive, and every charity board director in this city. They will read the forensic breakdown of your fraudulent existence over their morning coffee. I will authorize the publication of every bounced check, every predatory title loan, and every unpaid boutique invoice you generated over the past decade. The media will print the empirical evidence of your absolute poverty. You will become a permanent cautionary tale. You will possess zero social currency in this state. You will be a radioactive pariah. The threat was absolute. It relied on her deepest, darkest fear. She could survive a private bankruptcy, but she could never survive a broadcasted humiliation. The sheer, overwhelming weight of the legal and social annihilation crushed her remaining resistance. Sylvia Rowena, the woman who spent her entire existence dominating the Nevada elite, finally realized she was entirely outmatched. She was a defeated, obsolete entity. She did not utter another syllable. The disgraced matriarch slowly turned her back on the polished steel kitchen doors. She reached out and grabbed Bianca's arm, dragging the sobbing bride away from the boundary line. I stood in the shadows and watched their departure. They did not walk with the arrogant swagger they displayed in the foyer. They moved with the frantic, hunched posture of trespassers fleeing a secure perimeter. They navigated the long central aisle of the dining room, walking past the unblinking stares of the wealthy patrons they once desperately sought to impress. The elite society observed their exit in total silence, offering no sympathy and zero assistance. They reached the heavy glass front doors, pushed through the threshold, and disappeared into the sweltering desert night, leaving their unpaid invoice resting quietly on the pristine white linen. The heavy glass doors at the front of Aurelia closed, sealing the sweltering desert heat outside. The structural vacuum inside the dining room immediately collapsed, filling the space with a profound, satisfying quiet. It was the specific type of silence that follows a sudden recalibration of an entire ecosystem. The ambient jazz music continued its low, steady rhythm from the concealed ceiling speakers, washing over the imported rugs and the crystal chandeliers. The wealthy patrons seated at the surrounding tables returned their attention to their plates, but the atmospheric pressure of the room had permanently shifted. The Las Vegas elite are highly adaptable creatures. They survive by instinctively recognizing where the leverage resides. They witnessed the public financial execution of a woman who spent half a decade pretending to be their peer. They watched her illusion shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces of unserviceable debt. Now the hushed, excited whispers rippling across the dining room were no longer focused on the disgraced matriarch. The conversation centered entirely on the brutal, brilliant shift in power they had just observed. They were calculating my net worth, analyzing the precision of my corporate acquisition, and adjusting their social hierarchies to accommodate the new apex predator in the room. I did not linger near the reception desk to absorb their admiration. Basking in the aftermath of a successful audit is a beginner mistake. Gloating is an emotional luxury reserved for individuals who are genuinely surprised by their own victories. I knew the mathematical outcome of this evening the moment Rowena Capital wired the acquisition funds 6 days ago. The execution was merely a formality. I turned my back on the glittering dining floor and pushed through the brushed steel double doors leading into the culinary staging area. The sensory transition was immediate and visceral. The scent of expensive perfumes and forced pleasantries vanished, replaced by the sharp, authentic aroma of seared garlic, reduced wine demi-glace, and raw operational efficiency. The kitchen was a sprawling expanse of pristine stainless steel and white subway tile gleaming under bright fluorescent lights. The brigade of line cooks moved with choreographed urgency, communicating in clipped, precise phrases over the hiss of open flames. There was no performative theater here. There was only the rigorous demands of physical labor and culinary chemistry. This was the engine room of my new empire. I bypassed the expediter station where plates were undergoing final inspections and walked toward the private chef table tucked into a secluded alcove near the prep stations. It was a minimalist setup, a simple butcher block counter flanked by 2 metal stools, devoid of the plush velvet and acoustic glass that defined the VIP rotunda. It was a space designed for tasting and critique, not for showing off. I took a seat on the cold metal stool, resting my leather portfolio on the wooden surface. The adrenaline that typically accompanies a high-stakes confrontation began to recede, leaving a clear, focused calm in its wake. Vincent appeared from the main corridor, navigating the busy kitchen staff with diplomatic grace. He carried the silver tray holding the uncorked bottle of 1996 Estate Reserve. He did not ask about the scene in the foyer. He did not offer an unsolicited opinion regarding the departure of the bride's family. A seasoned general manager understands that commenting on the personal affairs of ownership is a terminal breach of fiduciary protocol. Vincent stepped up to the butcher block counter and poured the pale golden liquid into a fresh crystal flute. The delicate carbonation hissed softly. The unpaid invoice has been processed and logged as a localized operational write-off. Managing partner Vincent reported, his baritone voice blending into the ambient noise of the kitchen. The table is cleared, the rotunda is being prepped for the next scheduled seating. The floor is functioning at optimal capacity. I picked up the crystal flute. "Excellent work, Vincent," I replied, taking a slow, deliberate sip of the vintage champagne. The flavor was incredibly complex, carrying decades of careful preservation and calculated patience. Please ensure the service staff receives a substantial bonus on this pay cycle to compensate for the earlier disruption. I want the personnel to understand that current ownership values their discretion. Vincent offered a crisp, respectful bow. "Very generous, Ms. Rowena. I will authorize the payroll adjustment before the shift concludes." He pivoted and returned to the dining room, leaving me alone in the alcove. I watched the kitchen brigade operate. They worked with quiet dignity, executing complex recipes without demanding an audience. They were secure in their technical mastery. It was a stark contrast to the frantic, desperate energy my mother exerted to convince the world she possessed value. She functioned like a speculative stock, continuously inflating her own bubble until the market corrected the imbalance. Chef Laurent emerged from the hotline, carrying a modest ceramic plate. He did not wear the strained, forced smile of a man trying to appease a demanding socialite. His expression held the calm satisfaction of an artisan sharing his craft. He placed the dish onto the butcher block counter directly in front of me. It was not the imported poached lobster or the ostentatious caviar flight Sylvia had ordered to project an image of untouchable wealth. It was a simple presentation of roasted bone marrow, resting alongside a slice of charred sourdough bread, garnished with coarse sea salt and fresh parsley. It was peasant food elevated to a state of absolute perfection through sheer culinary mastery. "Sometimes the most complex flavors require the fewest ingredients," Laurent remarked, wiping his hands on a clean side towel. "I find the extravagant items on the menu are usually ordered by people who do not actually understand what they are eating. They are consuming a price tag. True appreciation requires a different palate." I looked at the legendary chef, recognizing the profound truth in his assessment. It is a philosophy that applies to far more than gastronomy. "Laurent," I noted, picking up a polished silver spoon, "it is the fundamental difference between equity and debt." Laurent offered a knowing smile, tapping his knuckles twice against the wooden counter before returning to his station to oversee the final dinner rush. I sat alone in the bright, sterile alcove of the stainless steel kitchen, reflecting on the nature of the ecosystem I had just conquered. My entire life, Sylvia tried to teach me that power was derived from visibility. She believed that commanding attention, securing the best table, and wearing the most expensive fabric was the ultimate metric of success. She operated under the delusion that if you screamed loud enough, the universe would eventually hand you a crown. Tonight dismantled that philosophy down to the bedrock. Performative wealth is loud. It is desperate, fragile, and inherently hollow. It requires constant maintenance and a relentless, exhausting campaign of public validation. It forces individuals to construct elaborate glass boxes to protect their fragile egos from the crushing reality of their own amortization schedules. And because it relies entirely on the perception of others, it is easily shattered by a single decline transaction at a merchant terminal. Real power operates on an entirely different frequency. Real power is built on intellect, patience, and airtight documentation. It does not require a sequined dress or a fabricated engagement to a commercial real estate heir. True sovereignty is possessing the leverage to dictate the terms of engagement without ever having to raise your voice. It is the ability to acquire the ground your enemies stand on while they are busy looking at the ceiling. I scooped a small portion of the rich roasted marrow, spreading it across the charred sourdough. I took a bite, letting the deep, authentic flavors ground me in the present moment. The taste was flawless, an undeniable testament to the value of genuine substance over superficial presentation. Through a small, reinforced ventilation window near the ceiling of the prep area, I could see the dark expanse of the Las Vegas night sky. The neon lights of the surrounding casinos blinked in rapid, chaotic sequences, desperately attempting to attract the attention of passing tourists. From this quiet, functional enclave, the flashing colors looked small and meaningless. The city outside was built on illusions, on the promise of sudden, unearned fortune, and the desperate projection of elite status. I did not need the illusion anymore. I possessed the deed to the machinery. I took another sip of the vintage champagne, feeling the cold crystal against my lip. I watched my staff execute their duties with flawless precision, fully in control of my empire, as the desert wind scoured the neon strip outside. There is a specific kind of silence that falls when a family's foundation finally cracks. It does not sound like breaking glass or tearing wood. It sounds like the quiet, terrified exhale of a parent who realizes their child has stopped believing in the illusion. Looking back at the wreckage of the engagement dinner inside the glass rotunda, the true tragedy was never a canceled wedding or a revoked credit card. The profound tragedy was a mother who spent 30 years building a house of mirrors, only to watch her daughters bleed from the shattered glass. In modern American culture, we are frequently sold a very specific, materialistic blueprint of success. The sprawling suburban home, the leased European vehicles, the flawless holiday cards, projecting an image of untouchable unity. We live in an era of hyper-visibility, where a family's worth is relentlessly measured against a curated digital feed. In this competitive environment, it becomes dangerously easy for parents to confuse emotional provision with material excess. We buy the designer clothes and orchestrate the lavish parties, convincing ourselves that these frantic expenditures are acts of love. But raising a family within a traditional structure requires a currency far heavier than a platinum credit line. It demands honesty. It requires the emotional awareness to recognize that children are not marketable assets designed to balance a parent's social ledger. They are observant, absorbent souls who learn the mechanics of love by watching how the adults in their lives handle their own deepest insecurities. When a mother hides her terror of bankruptcy behind a public demand for vintage champagne, she is not teaching her children strength. She is teaching them that survival requires deception. Fairness within a family is not merely about dividing assets equally. It is about distributing emotional validation without prejudice. When a mother banishes her eldest daughter to the shadows of an overflow lounge, she is doing much more than hiding a perceived financial liability. She is demonstrating the fatal, toxic flaw of conditional parenting. She is teaching her children that love is a transaction, contingent entirely on blind obedience and aesthetic perfection. If you conform to the expected narrative and marry the right suitor, You are rewarded with a seat in the VIP enclosure. If you choose independence and forge your own path, you are aggressively exiled. This is a devastating corruption of family responsibility. The primary duty of a parent is not to curate a child's public image, but to cultivate their internal character, equipping them with the resilience to navigate a world that will not always offer them a comfortable seat at the table. Consider the wildly divergent paths of the two sisters in the wake of their mother's philosophy. The younger daughter was the golden child, coddled and protected within the fragile bubble of her mother's fabricated wealth. She was taught to measure her human worth by the carat size of her engagement ring and the exclusivity of her dinner reservations. Yet when the financial truth was finally exposed to the dining room, she possessed no internal architecture to withstand the collapse. She was left hyperventilating in a sequined dress, watching her future evaporate because she had never been taught how to stand on her own 2 feet. She was handed the illusion of everything, and as a result, she was left with absolutely nothing. Then there is the daughter who was cast out. Exiled from the warmth of maternal approval, she was forced to navigate the cold, unyielding reality of independence. But in the quiet isolation of that exile, she learned the critical difference between performance and substance. She learned that true security is built on intellect, patience, and airtight documentation, rather than the fleeting, fickle approval of country club elites. The severe pain of rejection became the ultimate catalyst for profound self-reliance. This brings us to a difficult, deeply uncomfortable truth about raising children in today's society. We are culturally conditioned to believe that a parent's highest calling is to shield their children from hardship, poverty, and social discomfort. We bend over backwards to ensure they fit in, to ensure they carry the right labels, live in the right zip code, and maintain the right connections. We lie to them, and we lie to ourselves, simply to maintain the facade of suburban stability. But what if our conventional wisdom is entirely backwards? What if the most destructive thing a parent can ever do is hand a child a perfect, unearned life? When we insulate our children from the natural consequences of reality, when we finance their illusions, instead of forcing them to build their own equity, we are not protecting them. We are weakening them. We are turning them into fragile, dependent creatures who will inevitably collapse the moment the real world asks them to pay their own tab. Perhaps the greatest gift a parent can offer a child is not a trust fund, but the unfiltered, sometimes brutal truth of their own limitations. Honesty, even when it reveals our severe financial or emotional deficits, breeds respect. It teaches a child that resilience is infinitely more valuable than perception. Had the mother admitted her insolvency 5 years ago, had she sat her daughters down at a modest kitchen table and confessed her failures, the family might have faced a difficult, humbling season of downsizing. But they would have faced it together, grounded in authenticity. Instead, she chose the glass rotunda. She chose the performance. And she lost both of her daughters in the process. If you find yourself reflecting on the quiet fractures in your own family tree, or if you recognize the hollow echo of conditional love in your own history, you are not alone in the dark. These are the narratives that force us to look in the mirror and evaluate the ledgers of our own lives. If you are seeking stories that strip away the societal facade and expose the raw, unfiltered truth of human relationships, join our community. Share your own reflections in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe to Morning Revenge for more stories where quiet authenticity always outlasts the loudest illusion. As we navigate the complexities of our own legacies, we must ruthlessly ask ourselves what we are truly inheriting and what we are choosing to pass down. We spend our lives terrified of the dark, doing everything in our power to keep the stage lights burning brightly. Terrified that if the spotlight ever fades, our children will finally see us for who we really are. But the darkness is not the enemy. The darkness is where the foundation cures. The ultimate failure of a family is not running out of money. It is running out of truth. You can spend decades teaching a child how to dress and act like they belong at the head of the table, but the only lesson that actually matters The only lesson that will save them when the glass inevitably shatters is teaching them how to build the table themselves. Look closely at the people sitting across from you tonight. Are you feeding them a meal or are you feeding them a lie? The check always comes to the table eventually, and you can never pay it with an empty performance.